Welcome back to New Rockstars. I'm Erik Voss, and this is a complete breakdown of The Lord of the Rings of Power Season 2. From the stunning visuals to the spellbinding music by Bear McCreary, this season was an absolute feast for anyone who loves Tolkien's writing and world building, and it is my honor to complete this journey with you here at the end of things. I covered the first half of the season in a separate video like a month ago, and just to keep my full Season 2 analysis in one place for you, I put all my breakdowns for episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the first half of this video, even, my of the time speculation and mistakes, because they're so cute now. And I picked up right where I left off with episodes 5, 6, 7, and 8, right around the halfway mark of this video. So if you already watched the stuff from the first half, feel free to skip directly to the chapter for episode 5. If this is the first Rings of Power Season 2 New Rockstars video you've tapped on, welcome friend, and enter, because you're gonna wander and wonder through this lovely season with me. Okay, let's start with Season 2, Episode 1, Elven Kings Under Sky. This phrase, of course, comes from the first line of Tolkien's epigraph to The Lord of the Rings, the Ring verse. 3 rings for the Elven Kings under the sky, 7 for the Dwarf Lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. And it's those 3 rings this episode focuses on: Narya, the ring of fire, Nenya, the ring of adamant, also known as the ring of water, and Vilya, the ring of air. The elves are described as under sky because they, unlike dwarves or men, are considered the closest to the Valar and Eru Iluvatar, and with that status comes a folly, a blindness to the light. Tolkien uses that phrase "where the shadows lie" as a double meaning, not just where shadows lie upon the ground or other surfaces, but where the personified shadow, in this case Sauron, lies and deceives. We open on the 3-pointed iron crown of Sauron. Peter Jackson's team designed Sauron's crown on a John Howe painting of Morgoth and the spider killing the trees. The 3 points were actually, in this case, designed to hold the Silmarils. In the text, the crown was melted down, but in Peter Jackson's films and in this universe, Sauron took Morgoth's crown to make it his own. And I just think it's interesting that this episode's title evokes the elven jewels on the rings of Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, but its opening image is of the 3-pointed crown that evokes the sheaths of the elven jewels in the war from the previous age. You may remember that Sam references Morgoth's iron crown in the Two Towers text in one of the passages that Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens adapted for Sam's amazing monologue in the Two Towers film, in which Sam recognizes their own role as part of that same great tale that never ends. And these elves, by letting themselves become so dazzled by the 3 new jewels in the light of a tree that reminds them of Telperion, the Elven Kings Under Sky fail to see that they are in that same First Age conflict as well. We are now in the Forward Waith, centuries earlier at the dawn of the Second Age. This flashback opens in the same place where Galadriel finds Sauron's mark in the Season 1 premiere, creating a kind of parallelism between the characters, as Galadriel will one day be abandoned by her group in the same spot where Sauron, now in his original name as Mairon, suffers his Julius Caesar betrayal. Mairon says,
"Always after a defeat, the shadow takes another shape and grows again."
This is actually a quote from Gandalf's description of Sauron's return to Frodo in the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring. "Always after a defeat and a respite, the shadow takes another shape and grows again. I wish it need not have happened in my time," said Frodo. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But it is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." It's hard for me to read from these texts without getting a little emotional. Jack Lowden plays Mairon in this flashback, as logically Adar needs to have not recognized him with Charlie Vickers' appearance in the present day of the show. Adar was also recast from Joseph Mall in Season 1 and is now played by Samuel Hazeldine. Mairon says that he sees a new power.
"Not of the flesh, but over flesh. Power of the unseen world."
Yes, the unseen world, of course, referring to the alternate plane of existence that those who wear the One Ring and other rings kind of have access to seeing. It's believed Sauron retreats into the unseen world when he's defeated at the end of the Second Age that we saw in the Fellowship prologue, but you may remember that Celebrimbor used this same phrasing back in Season 1.
"We are on the cusp of crafting a new kind of power, not of strength, but of spirit. Not of the flesh, but over flesh."
And at the time, Galadriel asked Celebrimbor where he heard those words, and he was like, duh, 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 duh. And at the time, we were like, wait, did Sauron get to Celebrimbor at some point in the past? But this flashback proves that that did not happen. Sauron never met Celebrimbor before the Second Age, but they seem to be corrupted by the same shadow. Really, a question posed by the series is whether evil in the universe is sourced to beings like Morgoth and Sauron themselves, or if these characters are just giving in to external temptations that weigh like gravity upon all souls. Mairon preaches that his aim, at least for now, is to heal Middle-earth.
By bringing its peoples together to rule them all as one.
Yes, he shouts, "Rule them all!" to tease his ultimate desire to forge one ring to rule them all. But it's interesting to hear him talk about, at least publicly, his desire to heal, because that is the way Tolkien described this phase of Sauron's transition after Morgoth's fall. Adar holds the Iron Crown over Mairon's head, and he looks straight up through the ring with almost exact same framing as Gollum looking up through the ring at the climax of Return of the King when he finally got it in his fingers again. But Adar flips the crown and stabs him with it, leading to a swarm of orcs. I like how Sauron/Mairon manages to stab one on a sword tip that's sticking out through his chest, and then he pulls that sword out of his back to fight the others. Like, it's important to see how he was Morgoth's lieutenant. He is a badass, but upon his death, he emits a blast that freezes over the forward waif, similar to the 360-degree blast that he released when Isildur defeats him in the Fellowship prologue. The black blood oozes down into the cavern, and we get this great transition where we fade to black and then return to show the stalagmites of the cavern have now risen significantly, which shows the passing centuries and Sauron's coming rise. It's not unlike the sequence in Return of the King showing Smeagol's transition into Gollum over hundreds of years. The black goo consumes a rat and then a centipede and gains the ability to slither, and then he slips over a ledge. I just love this kind of drunken breath that he lets out. But it latches onto a cart, and I like how you can see it crawl up the back and then block out all the light on the other side of the carriage, suggesting it widened and then fully enveloped this woman. And we see her wine pouch dripping, and there is an interesting motif across these first few episodes of wine. Like, Adar describes how Sauron offered him wine when he was chained to the top of a mountain in the first age.
He offered me wine, red as a blood moon. He offered me wine on that dark and nameless peak. I drank it. I drank it all.
Celebrimbor in episode 2 opens a first age bottle of red, suggesting that while the War of Wrath was going on, this guy's like, I need to collect as much wine as I can.
I'm going to open a first stage bottle.
I have been saving it.
But fittingly, Celebrimbor never gets to drink it because he knocks over the bottle in shock. And then in episode 3, Pharazôn talks about drinking the wine left behind by his dead father.
Looking at a cup half filled with wine he'd drunk the night before. Seemed a betrayal to empty the glass. He also hated wasting good wine, so I drank it.
Pharazôn, after this, asks Miriel if she wants red or white for her coronation dress, which also kind of feels like a red wine versus white wine sort of thing.
Crimson for Numenor's future, or white her past.
So what's the deal with the wine here? It sounds like to drink or to even uncork wine is to surrender to the temptation of power on the show. Like, wine does not quench one's thirst, it just kind of dulls and intoxicates one's senses. But it is something sourced from the earth, from the grapevine, and it's bound to the earth and bound to generations of decomposed life and volcanic ash that enriches the soil. It's kind of like Sauron is running the vineyard from the soil that Morgoth tilled. After regaining human form, Halbrand/Sauron steps into a crossfade superimposition that makes it look like he's walking directly into flames, like reforging himself on this new life path to be a smith. Halbrand meets this man named Diarmid, who's played by Nicholas Woodson.
They say there's places across the sea a man can escape himself, find another path, perhaps another life.
Since Morgoth was a Valar who was banished and denied access to Valinor, the Maiar who served Morgoth, like Sauron, was also denied access. So the idea of a new life across the sea stings bitterly for Sauron here. The fact that Diarmid keeps calling him friend is something that Halbrand/Sauron will pick up as a way to disarm strangers, as we saw Halbrand do throughout season 1. On the ship, Diarmid tells him that the way to be good is to choose to be good each day, and the next until it becomes part of your nature. But Sauron doesn't even make it one day. The sea serpent, which Tolkien, by the way, also would call a fish dragon, so that's what I'm gonna call it, a fish dragon, because that's sick. It attacks, and Halbrand, given his first chance to be good, he just snatches that Southland King heraldry pouch from Diarmid and leaves the old man to die. The fish dragon beelines for Halbrand, but averts at the last second, because as we'll see later with the warg, Sauron has the ability to manipulate animals. It's part of how he is considered the Lord of Werewolves. Yes, he's a shapeshifter who's taken all kinds of forms, but he's also just someone who can kind of like control animals in this way. So my job is basically watching TV, and I watch all kinds of stuff there, from streaming shows to Blu-ray movies to live events and more. What I need from a TV is the best picture and video possible without having to navigate 1,000 menus every time the input changes and wondering if I forgot a setting somewhere. Samsung's Neo QLED 8K TV is loaded with AI features so that I get perfect picture and sound no matter what I'm watching. It's so wild. I think my favorite is the 8K AI Upscaling Pro, which can take any movie I watch and upscale it up to 90% the resolution of native 8K content. It means everything I watch is gorgeous. AI Motion Enhancer Pro made every Olympic event I watched look crystal clear, but it also takes the blur out of scrolling text, so it's easier for me to pick up on every detail in everything I watch. With the AI customization mode, I can effortlessly switch the settings from games to movies to sports to make sure the TV is giving what I'm watching the polish it needs to look the best it can be. For sound, Samsung's Q Series soundbar enables Q Symphony, which uses your TV speakers and soundbar together to add depth and clarity to whatever you're watching for a full surround sound effect so that you feel completely immersed. It rules. If you're a movie and TV nerd, you deserve the best TV and soundbar you can get. And Samsung's Neo QLED 8K TV and Q Series soundbar are the best combo I've ever come across. It's so crazy. Click the link in the description to get your new favorite TV today. So we will return to the moment where Galadriel met Halbrand, and their look just focuses a few seconds longer with some menacing music.
Tides of fate are flowing. Yours may be heading in. Or out.
Now, another motif that we see on the Rings of Power, at least more than we see in Peter, Fran, and Philippa's movies, is the importance of tides and waves to Tolkien. So Tolkien often wrote about a recurring nightmare that he had that he called his Atlantis complex the Great Wave, an apocalyptic tsunami that would rise up and swallow the land. He gave this dread to Faramir in the text, and in the films, Eowyn describes this dream in the Return of the King Extended Edition. It is, of course, the fate of Numenor. Mariel saw it in her vision last season, but tides and waves also play just a far bigger role for most of the characters on this series. Tides, of course, brought Galadriel and Halbrand together. Tides took Isildur's mother from him. They motivate Círdan, the shipwright. There was even the very first scene of the series, the flashback to Valinor with young Galadriel and her boat, and Finrod's wisdom about knowing the difference between the sky and the water that reflects the sky. So far, I'll say on the series, water has been largely a source of darkness, of chaos, and destruction. Galadriel fails to catch Elrond in the 3 elven rings, and right upon her arrival to face Gil-galad, dead leaves continue to fall from their great tree. Gil-galad asks,
Who is this man?
He is no man.
Ha! Her phrasing is a nod to Eowyn's big line in Return of the King.
I am no man.
Now, this series has to be a bit careful with how much it can reference the Lord of the Rings movies, which are still Warner Brothers things, and the Tolkien estate has dictated exactly how much this Amazon Prime show can reference and what parts of history. We should also recognize that Eowyn's line in Tolkien's text is different. She says, "But no living man am I." Galadriel confesses,
He is Sauron.
Crack is actually, I guess, a Neo-Sindarin expression that means something like danger, but the way Benjamin Walker says it, it's kind of like, God damn it. Galadriel says,
He deceived me. I was deceived.
No, Galadriel, you were blind.
They have Morfydd Clark repeat the word deceived, kind of to echo Kate Blanchett as Galadriel in the Fellowship prologue.
But they were all of them deceived.
Meanwhile, Elrond echoes his future Hugo Weaving self by saying,
They must be destroyed.
That decision is far above your privilege.
Yes, you can totally imagine this character standing right behind Isildur inside of Mount Doom. And in this shot, the camera swings around to frame Gil-galad and Galadriel together now, as the High King's position has swung against Elrond. Elrond's cape, you'll notice, bears this compass icon. And this is a common circle and diamond shape. We also see it in the clasps of Gil-galad's cape. And it seems to be honoring the guiding star and the moral compass of Elrond's father, Eärendil, who is honored as a statue in Numenor's harbor, looking out at the sea, much like Elrond does at this waterfall cliff. In the War of Wrath, Eärendil was aided by the Valar, and his fate was to eternally traverse the great ocean with the Silmaril from Morgoth's Iron Crown and guard the sun and moon. So now when Elrond says that he can't hand over the rings, you know I cannot, he's saying that it would really be a betrayal to his lineage and to his father, as Círdan compliments Elrond later.
You do your father proud.
Elrond and Dr. Richard Kimball's over the waterfall, and I love how, based on what happens in this episode, he ultimately does this for nothing. We transition to the volcanic fire of Mount Doom, where Elrond will, of course, one day beg Isildur to throw the One Ring into. Halbrand turns himself into Adar, and Charlie Vickers really heightens the Southlander accent to play the masquerade to Adar so that he can properly shake him with the phrase of
a power over flesh,
without tipping him off that he actually is Sauron. And on the way east to Rhûn, which is an area mentioned but actually unexplored by Tolkien's writings, the Istari stranger has a nightmare vision of a staff. Now, we don't know for sure yet if this is Gandalf or just one of the blue wizards or just a new Istari character. I will say that finally revealing that Halbrand was Sauron and freeing us from the mystery box guessing game of the character made him so much more fun to watch, and I hope that that will be the case with this wizard. I'm tired of wondering if he's Gandalf or someone else. But this season focusing so much on the staff could itself be a clue, because Tolkien derived the name Gandalf from the Old Norse words of Gand, which means wand or staff, and Alf, which means his name really translates to staff elf. The staff, or the Gand, is very important to the Gandalf character. Nori and Poppy underline this in episode 2.
He's afraid he'd lose control again without a Gand.
Now, in this scene, touching his Gand gives him visions of the lava in Mount Doom in the shape of an eye, as well as the Dark Wizard, played by Kieran Hines, and the Whirlwind with Nori and Poppy in coming episodes. He places his hand over the ground to magic the tree, and the shifting pebbles totally remind us of the grains of sand showing the formation of Arda in the opening titles from season 1 and technically season 2. Like, there has got to be a connection among this and Einar singing to assemble the world together, and even Diza singing to connect to the mountain. Similarly, the stranger producing beetles from the dead tree, doesn't it feel like a sort of false resurrection? The way the great tree in Linden comes back to life is really just like a false celebration. The stranger talks about his half-forgotten homeland.
Sometimes I perceive a glimmer of it, nonetheless. A longing for a feeling I can't remember or even name. But I know it's real, just beyond the sunset.
Yes, we are reminded of Frodo deep in Mordor when he forgot the pleasures of the Shire, like the taste of strawberries, and how important Sam and even his spice rack really were to the quest as a reminder of the home that they were fighting for. But I also cannot help but feel like the stranger is talking about Valinor, like a glimmer just beyond the sunset. It's kind of like he's reaching for the details that Gandalf paints to Pippin in Return of the King.
The grey rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. A far green country, and to a swift sunrise.
So we meet the Elf Lord Círdan, played by Ben Daniels, who's played a number of roles like in The Crown and as Rebel General Antok Merrick, Blue Squadron pilot in Star Wars Rogue One. Círdan was largely omitted from Peter Jackson's films, but in Tolkien's text, he was there at Elrond and Isildur's side for all the major events at the end of the Second Age. Círdan is a master shipwright for the elves. He oversees the construction of the boats that they take to Valinor. He's depicted here with a beard, and the following episode shows him shaving with a seashell. And I love this reference because it's referencing the debate among Tolkien scholars about Círdan's beard. When Frodo meets Círdan at the Grey Havens at the end of the Return of the King text, he's described by Tolkien as having a beard, but all elves are really just understood to be clean shaven. So everyone's kind of like, wait, huh? Why does he have a beard? So depicting him as initially bearded, followed by the shell shave, is kind of just the writers having some fun with this whole debate among the nerds. The Grey Havens of Linden are not yet as built up as they are when we see them at the end of Return of the King. And it's because Círdan at this point in history is really just keeping things simple with the humble workshop. The trip to Valinor is supposed to be a spiritual transition anyway, so it follows that this workshop should kind of feel like a simple monastery or like a funeral home, right? Like they're really building like floating elf caskets. Círdan looks out at the sunset. Yes, that is the music of Valinor that we heard last season, you know, when they just kind of stood on the boats. But for Círdan, he's also yearning for his brother, because Círdan was supposed to sail west to Valinor with his brother, but he missed the boat. He will eventually be on the very final boat that leaves Middle-earth long after we see Galadriel and Gandalf and Bilbo and Frodo and Elrond leave at the end of Return of the King. Gil-galad says that he should have Galadriel cast to the Etten Moors for what she's done. The Etten Moors are the highland of Eriador, known to the two-headed Ettins who resemble hill trolls. Círdan tells Elrond of a place to destroy the rings.
Long ago there was a battle, one whose weapons were the very bones of the continent.
He's referring to the War of Wrath, which resulted in the sinking of the Beleriand. And it's interesting how he describes the land as having bones. In episode 2, the Doors refer to the mountain as having bones. It's interesting across these cultures, they're talking about Middle-earth as if it's all part of one body. And here, Círdan is talking about a scar in that body. It just follows that if one part of the body is poisoned, like in the case of Mordor, all of Middle-earth is now ill. Nori and the stranger reunite with Poppy, who helps them realize that the words of The Wandering Day, the amazing song that closes closed their arc last season are really meant to be a literal Da Vinci Code for them to follow based on visual landmarks like we're in a National Treasure movie or the Goonies. Yes, it's very silly, but it does suggest that Poppy's mother, who taught her the words of that song, might have come from a generation of Harfoots who explored Rune and even included this closing lyric, "Not all who wonder or wander are lost," as a bit of encouragement that the path requires a bit of feeling like you're wandering, a bit of imaginative wondering whether something looks like a tree or a stone or not, and to just trust the song in your heart. And I think there's something beautiful about that. As Círdan prepares to drop the 3 rings into the crack, the tides of fate bump his boat to knock the pouch open a bit, which is another example of a great wave, even a small wave, but still a wave, bringing further chaos into this world. This scene happens just before daybreak. You can actually see the sun about to rise on the east behind Círdan. The light of the Valar is not in control here. The darkness of the water is. Adar and Waldreg force Sauron to declare loyalty.
I vow to serve the Lord of Mordor to the end of my days and his.
Yeah, he pulled a verbal fast one there. He doesn't vow to serve Adar in particular. He only vows to serve himself because he views himself as the Lord of Mordor. And the framing of the shot leaves one eye exposed, the literal eye of Sauron gazing into his future. Círdan arrives in Lindon wearing Narya. Nenya tumbles to Galadriel's feet. Gil-galad puts on Vilya, and they're all just kind of like enchanted by these rings. Like they are not themselves at all in this moment. Light returns to the great tree, causing it to glow like Telperion, and Galadriel smiles, I think more than Morfydd Clark has ever smiled on this show. Like she's definitely back to being that little girl on Valinor looking up at the 2 trees with her brother. But listen to the music here. Yeah, it's kind of like a minor chord there, right? It evokes the melody of Howard Shore's The Pity of Gollum, the song that plays over the final moments of Two Towers. The music that Barry McCreary comes up for the show is like the best part of it. Galadriel, Círdan, and Gil-galad hold their hands together with this overhead shot that matches Peter Jackson's shot from the Fellowship prologue. Okay, on to season 2, episode 2, Where the Stars Are Strange. This episode opens with the eye-shaped lava pool in Mount Doom that the Istari saw, and there is an interesting effect where the blackness spreads from Mount Doom up through the map toward Khazad-dûm, suggesting that it really is the cancer from Mordor that is disrupting Khazad-dûm. And while we were following the darkness, we dissolve into the mountains and it's beams of light we now follow instead, which I just think is an interesting metaphor for this season, how even light can be deceptive because it is really coming from a darkness that they cannot see. We follow the light angled from the mirrors that they used to grow crops in the caverns. As we saw in season 1, this is really just like an essential part of the agriculture of the dwarves. After mining Mithril with Elrond against his father's wishes, Prince Durin IV is now an outcast, shopping for discount produce with Diza.
I'm bound to the dwarf I love, and I wouldn't trade his heart for a mine full of fire opals.
Fire gems, yet it was Narya, the Ring of Fire, that Círdan betrayed his heart for. And you hear a lot the term bound or bind, and it's just an interesting recurring word that obviously reminds us of In the Darkness Binds Them, right? An earthquake causes a huge chunk of rock to smash the bridge. If you look closely, at least 9 dwarves die immediately. Now there's an updated opening title sequence for season 2. The earth tones of the sand in season 1 have now shifted to red, which could just connote something as simple as blood, but I see it as the red wine of Sauron intoxicating all of these characters through this grapevine. The sands form literally 19 rings, 3 rings for the elves, plus 7 for the dwarves, plus 9 for the men. That equals 19. We don't see the 1 that has been forged somewhere else yet because we haven't gotten there. Next, it kind of forms this tree shape, maybe like the golden great tree in Lindon, or the tree of friendship that Elrond gave Durin, maybe the white tree of Numenor. Next is a crown beneath the 7 stars of Durin. This is the symbol of Khazad-dûm. Next, an elegant archway. These are the doors of Durin that I think we're gonna see made on this series. Next, we see the horns of a Balrog. Next, we see the red iris of an eye, in which the red sand grains form bloody veins of that eye. So it's kind of like a bloodshot eye that's been open and staring at us for far too long. You'll notice there's more of a focus in these season 2 credits on images associated with Khazad-dûm, and I think they want us to link Diza's singing to the Song of the Ainur. We find Galadriel in a dream, planting seeds at the memorial tree of her brother Finrod. Galadriel has now gotten a glow up to go with her fancy ring, Nenya, with her hair braided in an interesting configuration and a golden leaf circlet. Celebrimbor appears to announce an unexpected visitor, and Sauron's voice echoes in her mind. and we see that the seeds she planted were actually roots for Sauron's deadly grasp. Celebrimbor speaks the ring verse in Sindarin as the roots strangle and impale his body and turn him into wood, transforming him into essentially his own headstone. So I think Galadriel is both reading Sauron's mind in this moment on what he plans to do to Celebrimbor when he's done with him, but also just seeing a possible future. So it's just another example of like nature, light, water, trees, things that we should like. Sauron is taking them and twisting these wholesome, healthy things into sinister forces. Galadriel warns Gil-galad.
For that he needs not armies, but rings.
And yes, Gil-galad immediately covers Vilya for the moment she says this, for fear that someone's going to take his precious from him. I fully expected him to go Bilbo and go, ah! Sauron is turned away from Eregion, but he turns his back to Celebrimbor's assistant to show his wounded back from his torture from Waldreg, making sure to fan out the tear in his clothes so that she can see that wound clearly. Just knowing that these elves are going to take pity on him and appeal to their customs of hospitality. In Rune, we visit Karas Gaer, the Dark Wizard's fortress. We see a blood ritual with these white-winged moths that the Dark Wizard conjures back into his acolyte from season 1. The light causes her cloak to even look like the folded wings of a moth. I love that detail. The Dark Wizard says,
"The blood I wasted to bring you before me should have been spent on more useful servants."
Curious to know what's in that back room over there. Some are speculating that this character could be Saruman, but the fact that this guy is already involved with dark deeds doesn't really line up with what we know about Saruman's backstory. He really came up as like a very by-the-books wizard until Sauron infects his mind in the Third Age. Nori and Poppy pitched names for the stranger: Doderic, Andwise, and Fredegard. These are all just kind of like Hobbit names pulled from the text. There's like a Doderic Brandybuck from Lord of the Rings Online. There's an Andwise Roper, who's Samwise Gamgee's uncle. And then there is a Fredegar Fatty Bolger, a hobbit from the books who was friends with Merry and the other hobbits, but was too scared to go with them when they left the Shire. Now, the desert riders who pursue them for the Dark Wizard had their Mad Max masks added in post-production, according to the showrunners. That could be why their masks just look a little too shiny or just like steampunky for Middle Earth. So we see the exterior gates of Khazad-dûm after the earthquake, and notice how one of the dwarf statues that was there in the earlier shot has now crumbled. We meet the dwarf Narvi, whose name in the future will appear alongside Celebrimbor on the doors of Durin, so I assume this character is going to return. Diza's stone singing only makes things worse. So clearly the return of Sauron was so discordant that it ruined the harmonic connection between the dwarves and the rocks. He's like the person at the concert who's trying to sing along with Taylor or Olivia and is just so tone deaf and just ruins the experience for everyone. Galadriel meets Elrond as he works on a boat, and I love that we go from this initial shot of him just like sanding something small in the foreground, and then we cut to this reverse shot that shows, oh, actually he's whittled down an entire freaking tree trunk. It's kind of like in the Will Ferrell movie Elf, when we see how fast elves are expected to build toys. Same rules apply to the toiling of elves in Middle-earth. Galadriel says,
Sauron used me, and under his hand I was played like a harp to a melody not of my choosing.
It was entirely of your choosing. Sauron looked inside you and plucked the very song of your soul, note by note.
Composer Barry McCreary in this moment plays Sauron's theme with a harp in the background. Just another example of Sauron's melodic manipulation. Círdan tells Elrond that the rings themselves can still be a pure source of good, despite the context that created them being corrupted.
Judge the work, and leave judgment concerning those who wrought it to the judge who sees all things.
Knowing that it was a writer's room that produced this line, it touches on the debate of separate the art from the artist that fans of properties are struggling with nowadays. Like when you have authors like J.K. Rowling taking certain stances online. Is it still okay to love Harry Potter? Of course it is, but you do have to do some like mental compartmentalization, right? And not all people, especially not all age groups, are capable of doing this. As Círdan says, it takes humility, and that humility takes decades of life experience to accept. And meanwhile, Elrond, as the younger of the two, is really speaking to the part of society who is insisting on purity tests. I just love this whole conversation because I don't think either character is wrong, but ultimately history will prove Elrond to be the more correct of the two. Círdan sticks his hand with Narya into the water to command some fish, and I love the scared little jump that Elrond does when the fish jumps out. The Istari stranger finds the Gond from his vision as the brace pole at the well, and he uses it to create a whirlwind to take out the Dark Wizard's riders, but also it blows his Hardfoot friends away, like the kids at the bounce house in the accident. Celebrimbor shows his assistant his latest invention.
I have called it Ithildin, made from a last sliver of mithril.
Out of the moonlight, it is all but invisible.
Yes, Ithilden was what was on the doors of Durin and Fellowship that only revealed itself in the moonlight. Sauron too is revealed in the moonlight down in the courtyard, and he focuses his concentration on summoning the rainstorm. We have to acknowledge that this is the worst umbrella design ever. It does not keep the person holding the umbrella dry, and Celebrimbor looks soaked too. So how useful is this? Sauron manipulates Celebrimbor by appealing to him as a craftsman who wants above all else credit for his work.
It's the oldest tale there is, isn't it? The true creators toil till their knuckles bleed, and then they come along, take whatever profits them most, and forget all about us.
And again, just pointing out that this show was written by a writer's room as the 2023 Writers Guild strike was looming. Sauron notices Celebrimbor weeping upon learning that his 3 rings worked, and he takes a moment to make a move on this crybaby and pronounce himself as a messenger from the Valar. Sauron extinguishes all the light sources from the room, and he blazes the hearth and re-presents himself in the form of Anatar.
Never again will the world overlook you as the mere scion of Fëanor, but forevermore revere you, the Lord of the Rings.
Okay, I did not need Anatar to say the Lord of the Rings. Like, we get it. But the visual majesty of this whole presentation is undeniably great. Like, he absolutely looks like an angel coming from heaven. And they even darken his face by the light beyond him. It's not his appearance, it's like the light that he has dressed himself with. And notice how Charlie Vickers has dropped the Southlander accent and just speaks in this kind of posh English brogue, the kind that the characters play the elves use. Now, for context, Tolkien described Anatar this way: wearing the fairest form that he could contrive. In Eregion, Sauron posed as an emissary of the Valar, sent by them to Middle-earth or ordered by them to remain there to give aid to the elves. And then in another passage, Sauron took to himself the name of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. But the fairest form that he could contrive? It's worth noting that Halbrand was an invention by this show. So when Charlie Vickers appeared just wearing a wig in the trailers, various skeptics, including myself, wondered, how is Celebrimbor gonna not recognize Halbrand? This is why we have to just be patient and wait for these shows to provide the answers. Sauron in these episodes earns Celebrimbor's trust by telling partial truths and appealing to his ego. And then he puts on this spectacle to make him look like he carries the light of the Valar and is so blinding. And Celebrimbor is so needy of validation that it works. And we've been in this position before. We've been blinded by problematic people in our lives who are in plain sight just because we need them to be what we want them to be. But make no mistake, this form of Anatar comes not from the sunlight, but from the fire. Fire that is no different than the fires of Mount Doom. Now, I have to say, in these first few episodes, I have not been crazy about the contrived communication barriers to keep Celebrimbor in Eregion with Anatar, and then Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, and Gil-galad, and Lindon, and all of them so far unable to see Anatar. But I'm curious to see if this little charade works on them too, or whether his light will just reshape their reality so that they don't really see the face of Halbrand anymore. Season 2, Episode 3, The Eagle and the Sceptre. This episode opens as a horse short film, following Barrick, Isildur's horse, who's just too restless to join Elendil and Valandil and the Numenorians back to Numenor. And I keep wearing this horse boy shirt for a reason, because this world lives and dies based on where solo horses gallop and how fast they do it. Grab this shirt at nerdriot.shop. I'm Erik Voss, and this is Barrick Boss, horse kicking an orc into a tree branch, which just shows that this horse also understands the power of trees on this show. Barrick finds Isildur in this cave.
Barrick. My boy.
Ah, but this is no cave. This is Shelob's lair. Yes, the Shelob from Return of the King. Shelob is the last child of Ungoliant, the spider creature that helped Morgoth kill the 2 trees. But Shelob is noticeably smaller in this series than she is when she fights Sam, of course, because, you know, we're still a whole age away from that. Still, in the most graphic death yet on this season, the spider leaps on this orc's head and then just like crushes the head and rips it apart. And then right after doing that, I love this, she raises her legs in a kind of flexing posture, like a WWE wrestler saying, "You're next, brother." But they're able to get away, thank God. I hate spider scenes. And back in Numenor, Elendil, who's already there, places a seashell on the tomb of the late king Tar Palantir, while Elendil's daughter, Eärien, calls him out.
As king, he always protected the faithful.
You speak so freely of dead kings, yet you refuse to utter your own son's name.
Just a reminder that Eärien is a creation of the show, and they seem to have raised the status of the character in this season now that her voice is going to be a significant anti-Miriel faction in court. With this line, she also reminds me of Gandalf in Return of the King, who lamented Minas Tirith's descent into a society focused on building tombs and heraldry from the past and not on their living descendants. So she's also saying, hey, you're not properly mourning Isildur, and you're also not properly focusing on your daughter. And he's probably like, hey, you weren't even in the books. Now, the statue in the background of this funeral chamber Mordor looks like a weeping woman, and it could be Nienna, the queen of the Valar, who is acquainted with grief and sorrow, but also pity and courage. Muriel, left blind by the events of season 1, asks Elendil to be her eyes of the political drama that's unfolding. We meet Lord Belzegar from the north, shaking hands with Pharazôn. It seems like they're going for what we often saw in The Sopranos. Funerals are common places where power brokers conspire and forge new alliances. A mother of a dead Numenorian soldier slaps Muriel, similar to the grieving Miss Kittner slapping Chief Brody in Jaws. Pharazôn offers Muriel the options of a crimson dress or a white dress for the coronation, and Muriel can only remember that her father wore white, signaling that he was focused on the Numenorians' elven past, and that an eagle appeared.
It is rare for an eagle to grace a coronation. Should one make an appearance at yours, it would be seen as an auspicious omen.
Ooh, signs and portents! It's not known in Tolkien's writings for eagles to have this kind of like magical or symbolic sign off on transitions of power. Like they're not like Articuno or some shit. But Peter Jackson made the choice not to have animals like eagles and wargs talk, even though eagles absolutely talk in Tolkien's text. And the fact that this show sticks to it is just like kind of a bummer, because I want to hear what these eagles actually have to say. And the fact that Peter Jackson didn't let them talk is part of the reason why so many people were like, oh, why didn't they just take the eagles to Mordor to destroy the rings? Well, if you learn that these eagles actually can talk and have a reason not to get involved in the conflict because of past wars in the First Age, you know the answer to that question. Like if they tried to fly the rings over there, they would have been spotted by, you know, the Fellbeasts and by the Eye of Sauron, and they would have been taken down. They had to be sneaky and hand walk them into Mordor with two unassuming hobbits who can turn themselves into rocks at a moment's notice. But in the scene, Muriel chooses the humbler white gown, which Pharazôn definitely takes note of, who totally wears red at the coronation later. He knows what he's doing. Back in Mordor, Adar speaks with Glug, and I love this name, Glug. This is an orc who has a wife and child. Now, you've probably seen some of the consternation over this online, but just to clarify, while Peter Jackson's films showed the Uruk-hai hatching out of mud pods, and orcs have primarily just been depicted as an evil, spiteful race who just are the baddies, there are several examples in Tolkien's writings in which orcs were understood to have their own society and reproduce sexually. In Return of the King, Frodo told Sam the shadow did not give life to the orcs, it only ruined them and twisted them, and if they are to live at all, they have to live like other living creatures. In the Annals of Aman, Tolkien wrote, "For the Orcor had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar, and not that had life of its own, nor the semblance thereof could ever Melkor make since his rebellion." And then in a 1963 letter to Ms. Munby, Tolkien wrote, "There must have been orc women," but just admitted that the story he was telling focused on their service as soldiers to evil lords. Look, I think we all know there's just going to be some people who don't like this show who are going to use this as an example of how it's changing Lord of the Rings. But the reality is, many fans' understandings of Lord of the Rings begin and end with the interpretation in the Peter Jackson films. And the showrunners of the show, Patrick and JB, I think are bigger Tolkien nerds than most people complaining about this show on the internet. To be clear, there are plenty of gripes to be had with this show, from its pacing to its logic issues to a lot of goofy dialogue. But, you know, I think when it comes to getting Tolkien right, it pretty much knows what it's doing, aside from letting the eagles talk. Adar welcomes Damrod, hill troll of the Ered Mithrin, killer of stone giants, eater of dragon bones. He's voiced by Gil-galad actor Benjamin Walker, and I like how in these scenes, when Adar pats Glug's chest, you'll notice that Adar still has that scar on his hand from when Halbrand stabbed him at the end of last season. Celebrimbor welcomes Durin and Disa to Eregion, showing them a new forge expansion that's being built with 7 slots for the 7 dwarf rings they plan to cast. And I love how during the scene, Anatar stays in the shadows, watching down over them from the upper level, letting Celebrimbor do the talking for him. But also note there are 7 lights above Anatar's head, like the 7 stars of Durin in the Khazad-dûm sigil. But Anatar initially misjudges Durin.
Bringing your father a means of saving his kingdom might be just the way to earn back his respect. Perhaps even your inheritance.
It's not Durin's inheritance or even the respect of his father that fully drives him. It's really his friendship with Elrond. But then when Durin calls bullshit on Anatar, and even knowing Elrond, Anatar gets so petty.
Elrond said that you were the wisest of all the dwarves. Did he speak true? Or is there someone else we should be treating with?
I also appreciate the camera tricks in this section to really set Durin and Disa in an elf realm where everything would be bigger to them. They use forced perspective camera angles, larger doubles of the forge set that are built higher up to their chests. And in the courtyard outside, they use VFX to blend the characters into the background so that when Disa walks away, she walks just past these 2 taller elves. It's so smooth that it's just even hard to notice all the work that they did to make this work. Isildur finds a dead soldier in a puddle and takes his boots. Visually, this location reminds us of the dead marshes from 2 Towers, but those dead faces would not be there in the water yet, because those were actually soldiers from the Battle of Daggerlad in the Last Alliance years from now. But ultimately, Isildur will reach his own watery fate someday, not far from this area, after he takes one ring from Sauron. He's stabbed in the thigh by Estrid, and he snaps at her for taking out the knife, which I was happy to see, because TV shows always yank out the weapon after someone gets stabbed, and medically that is the worst thing to do. Leave it in until you get to the doctor. In Pelargir, which is an old Numenorian settlement that we'll see a lot more on this show, maybe even to next season, Arondir saves Isildur and Estrid from wildmen as he gathers firewood for Bronwyn's funeral pyre. So actress Nazanin Boniadi chose not to return for the second season and is taking a break from acting, and her character was killed off screen, supposedly from a foul-tipped arrow. Arondir tries to be a father figure to Theo, and I like using his woodland elf strength. He's able to carry 8 buckets at a time, while Theo just carries 1. Arondir says that he was born in Beleriand.
Now it lies under the wave.
Ah, wave. Another example of describing water itself as a wave. Like all water in the show is a form of Tolkien's great wave. Theo tells Arondir, "Did you know my father? No? Neither did I. And I know he wasn't you." Theo in season 2 reminds me of Jack from Into the Woods, who in Act 2 becomes a bitter orphan who's bent on revenge and has to understand that we're all just part of a story. Yes, my money is on him to become one of the ring-bearing kings who become the Nazgul. He's just, kind of a crank. Isildur confesses that his mother drowned by saving him when he was 10 and he swam out further than he should have into a riptide, but he never told anyone it was his fault.
Ever since I felt bound to try and do something singular, something special, to try and find a way to earn what she did.
Ah, again, bound, as in the darkness, bind them. Estrid responds,
I don't know if you can earn a thing like that. I think you just have to accept it as a gift.
As in Boromir describing the One Ring as a gift at the Council of Elrond. Theo cries while he listens to this, making me wonder if he might feel responsible for Bronwyn's death in a similar way, and that both of these men will grow older seeking rings of power as ways to redeem their dead mothers. Estrid covers her brand mark from Adar with a new burn scar tissue. It's clear that she did something she's not proud of in service to Adar. Isildur and Theo team up in a very silly yet somewhat successful plan to get Barrick back from the Wildmen. Theo gets held, but the group is ambushed by, we're pretty sure these are Ents, based on the way Theo gets lifted up. But the first move that the Ents did was to throw one of the axes back at the lumberjacks. Like, we've definitely seen Ents throw giant chunks of stone when they're sacking Isengard, but to fling an axe with this kind of accuracy, that's impressive. We end the episode back in Numenor for the coronation. Miriel wears white, but Farazan wears red. It seems like actually it's Belzegar who somewhere in the background begins a shout of, the queen who lies. It was him, just to get the crowd going. Earian produces the Palantir to accuse Miriel of using Elven sorcery to guide her decision making. And even with Farazan trying to give her an out by saying that the true ruler would never do this, and he orders the Seeing Stone destroyed, something he does, by the way, because from his meeting earlier with Miriel, he knows that she is totally a crystal girl. Miriel takes the bait.
No! The Palantir is mine. We need it.
Yes, it's mine. I need it. We are totally reminded of Frodo saying, the ring is mine, when he was so close to dropping the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom. But an eagle arrives, presumably as a good omen for Miriel to bless her coronation. But Farazan opportunistically seizes this moment with the sunlight brightening his red clothes for everyone to see, and Belzegar gets his goofiest slow clap chant going. This is why I'm really mad at this decision to not let the eagles talk, because if the eagle could talk, he could easily just clear things up. He'd be like, oh, no, I'm not here for this guy, I'm here for her. Or couldn't the eagle, just kind of use a wing or a talon to knock Farazan over out of the way and then bob his head toward Miriel? This whole moment just is kind of weird. Apparently, according to editors who worked on the season, they had to remove a lot of key Numenor scenes. So it kind of resulted in the Numenor subplot just feeling rushed and confusing. This is what happens when you insist on shooting a show during a writer's strike and you don't have writers on set who can do late rewrites to fix this kind of stuff. Next, season 2, episode 4, Eldest. So who are the Eldests of this episode? Tom Bombadil, of course, but let's not forget the trees and the Ents. This is a big tree episode. The branches of trees will inevitably give this Alf his Gand, but the term Eldest is a superlative form of the word elder, which is a type of wood that Potterheads know as the source of the Elder Wand, which both refer to the type of wood the wand was made out of and the ancient status of the superior wand. So maybe JD and Patrick are saying the wizards and wands of this universe are older than anything J.K. Rowling wrote wrote. So we open on one of the things Elrond carved a tree down into, Círdan's Valinor boats, but turning their back on that promised afterlife voyage are Elrond and Galadriel. The camera stays on those boats through the marching troops. In general, I just love the camera work and the blocking between Elrond and Galadriel as each of them childishly upstage each other by stopping in their tracks while the other steps forward and forces that one to turn around. Elrond does it first and then Galadriel does it too. The squad they assemble includes Vorhil, Camnir, Rian, and Daemor, and these poor elves in this episode, they're like the kids in the back of the van while mom and dad are arguing over directions. Galadriel in this episode has tied her hair up in this interesting braid. In Tolkien's letter 348, he wrote she was then of Amazon disposition and bound her hair as a crown when taking part in athletic feats. And I just love how Galadriel in this episode totally embodies that. Based on the map of the Axa Bridge, it crosses over the Brandywine River, meaning that we would be south of where the Shire will eventually be settled and north of Sarn Ford. And this episode gives a pretty huge reference to the Shire. It's so cool what this episode does with that. In the past, we've wondered if Poppy Brandyfoot could actually be the source of the name the Brandywine. And I'm sure if that actually gets established in the show, no one's gonna be mad, right? Actually, one of my favorite transitions on this series is how they dissolve from the ink of the map to the real location. Remember before they showed the letters of Rune glowing like a Theoden on the nighttime desert and that cross dissolve, and here the bridge that was completed on the map cross dissolves into it being collapsed in real life. Elrond observes it was caused by lightning and Galadriel assumes it was Sauron. We know Sauron can control the weather because he conjured the storm in Eregion. Maybe that storm continued to just kind of like float around at different access points around Eregion and geographically sealed it off. Also notice that it looks like the river below has been drained, and Gil-galad mentioned seeing rivers running dry in his visions back in episode 3. They elect to go south through the Turn Gorthad, otherwise known as the Barrow Downs, which in the text is actually where the hobbits meet Tom Bombadil, which is just fun that we see Tom Bombadil in a different location in this episode. But when this location gets mentioned, Galadriel's mind drifts. For these wearers of trinkets, nothing triggers them more than a hand reaching out toward them from the abyss. Because it's kind of like, they're gonna take my ring. I also appreciate the possibility that Sauron might actually have less to do with these roadblocks, and it's actually just Galadriel is that paranoid, and just that paranoia has been one effective way he has gotten under her skin. In Rune, the Istari stranger finds this guy, Tom Bombadil, played by Rory Kinnear. Tom Bombadil shows up in the Old Forest in Fellowship of the Ring, singing songs and possessing a mysterious magical quality, such as being resistant to the One Ring, being able to chill out Old Man Willow and face down the Barrow-wights. J.R.R. Tolkien has never established what exactly he is, but readers have speculated that he could be a Maiar or just some kind of earthly spirit. Really, Tom Bombadil is like just kind of a vibe, and it's so cool to see him finally in live action because Peter Jackson omitted Tom Bombadil from his films. When asked about Tom Bombadil, Tolkien wrote in a letter, "Do you think Tom Bombadil, the spirit of the vanishing Oxford and Berkshire countryside, could be made into the hero of the story? Or is he, as I suspect, fully enshrined in the enclosed verses?" Here, Tom sings,
"Hey, dog, merry dog, ring a dong, tell her, sand lies in the grass, lead around the wood."
These are the lyrics of the nonsensical walking song that Tom sings around the hobbits in Fellowship, and they are listed in the index as one continuous song. Just read these lyrics. They're crazy, but it's what Tom Bombadil's all about. Tom comes back to different parts of these lyrics throughout the episode, but you'll notice that sandflies in the grass, bees around the willow are new lyrics. So Tom apparently changes the words as he goes throughout his life, or whatever you call his existence. But who knows, maybe bees around the willow is just him singing to those bees that are in his line of sight with the beehive in the background. When that scrap of Sadoc's map leaves a stranger's hand and lands on the branch of Old Man Ironwood, the way Tom watches it implies that he might be controlling that wind, or he can commune with the forces or the force that is controlling this breeze. The stranger thinks this branch is the Gond from his visions, but the tree swallows him. I like how many of these effects look practical. They use the tree's branch and the leaves to mask the final slurp of the stranger's hand behind the bark. But of course, this is based on the hobbits' run-in with Old Man Willow in Fellowship. In the Old Forest, Old Man Willow was a spirit in a tree who wrapped around Merry and Pippin, but Tom Bombadil sings to the tree. A similar scene occurs in Two Towers in the Fangorn Forest, but it's Treebeard, the Ent, who saves them. This tree is named Old Man Ironwood, and I'm going to assume that he's somehow related to Old Man Willow. Nori and Poppy meet Merrimack, played by Gavi Singh Chera, who is a Stoor. Stoors are one of the 3 breeds of genealogical predecessors to hobbits, along with Harfoots and Fellowhides. Merrimack introduces himself as Nobody, which feels like it might be a reference to the Odyssey, when Odysseus cleverly tells the Cyclops that his name is Nobody, so that when he stabs the Cyclops in the eye, the Cyclops is like, "Ah, nobody's blind me," and everyone else is like, shut the hell up, dude. We actually hear some similar wordplay from the Goond later.
Nobody's that stupid.
The Goond says,
"Oh, so he's a great big grand elf."
We are definitely getting closer to them finally revealing this guy to be Gandalf, especially all the stuff about names being things that you use yourself coming from this stranger this episode, and the importance of his quest in past episodes, and the importance of this quest for this branch, and of course Tom Bombadil's line later.
Wizard's staff is like a name. It's yours to wield already.
We also heard this line though.
Well, the only wizard under these skies is the Dark Wizard.
So I don't know, maybe we could look at the stranger and this Dark Wizard as the two blue wizards. I'm leaning more towards Gandalf though. Brank, the captain of the Guard Dream, says the wizard has joined up with the hermit, which confirms that Tom must be the hermit and maybe the same hermit of the Hermit's Hat constellation. Now, we see Brank and the God Dream throughout this episode, and apparently, according to JD and Patrick, every time we see their mask, it has been CGI'd in to cover their faces. That's why it looks so shiny. They did a pretty good job with the CGI, but apparently they also had to ADR over what they were saying before. I just have a lot of questions over what really these writers are all about. Tom Bombadil pulls the stranger out of Old Man Ironwood.
Eat earth. Dig deep. Drink water.
This is what Tom says to Old Man Willow to free the hobbits and Fellowship, and in the movie Two Towers, Peter Jackson gives the line to Treebeard.
Eat earth, dig deep, drink water.
And since the stranger getting sucked into Old Man Ironwood was practical, I love that his being freed from the tree is also practical. Rory Kinnear uses his body to block the opening, and David Wayman comes out of a concealed opening. Tom says,
"Back in the Withy Windle, folk used to call me Bombadil."
The Withy Windle is a tributary feeding into the Brandywine River, and it's around where Tom lives in Fellowship. He actually has a song about it, because of course he does. Inside, Tom continues his walking song.
Down west sinks the sun, soon you will be groping. Don't be bashful now, Goldberry.
When the night shall fall,
then the door will open.
So the stranger asks who the other voice was, and we heard Tom call her Goldberry, and Goldberry is Tom's wife in the Old Forest. Little is known about the origin and nature of Goldberry, except that it is implied that she is a river spirit of the river Withywindle, and it is said that she is the river woman's daughter. Tolkien describes Goldberry as the seasonal changes of nature, and Tom Bombadil is the nature spirit of the English countryside. Both Tom and Goldberry are primal spirits of nature, he of the land and its produce, and she of the water. But I'm curious about Tom's response about this voice, and he says, "Is some other person here?" And he's like, "No," but it's probably because he doesn't consider her a person. Like himself, he is just a spirit, a force of nature. But I just love the way Rory Kinnear plays this so aloof and chill, you know? He doesn't really get rattled by anything. It could just be only he can really see this spirit, and the spirit is really just invisible to the nature. In fact, the spirit might have just been the wind that blew that map out of his hand. So any kind of like moving fluid, whether it's water or wind, that's basically what she is. Tom says,
"And I am old, Eldest." Tom was there before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn.
This comes from Tom's quote in Fellowship. "Eldest, that's what I am. Mark my words, my friends. Tom was here before the river and the trees. Tom remembers the first raindrop and the first acorn. He made paths before the big people, and he saw the little people arriving. He was here before the kings and the graves and the barrow wights. When the elves passed westward, Tom was here already, before the trees were bent. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from the outside." Tom says that part here, and he adds this.
He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless. This old place used to be green. Now, it's all sand.
So I think we're actually getting some backstory on Rune, the eastern part of this world. I wonder if it's because the people from the east served Morgoth in the first age, and the Valar punished it by turning it into a desert. The dark under the stars when it was fearless. It's just such an interesting phrase that I'm pretty sure just applies to Morgoth, or just whatever the shadow is. Meanwhile, the elves get down on the Barrow Downs. They hear a voice in the wind. This is the chant of the Barrow-wights from the Old Forest that Fran and Philippa actually gave as a line to Gollum in Two Towers when he was just creeping everyone out by talking to himself.
Cold be heart and hand and bone, and cold be travelers far from home.
In fact, in the vocal mix, one of the voices kind of sounds like Andy Serkis's Gollum.
Never walked awake or stony bed, never.
We learn that Sauron's return has so toxicified this land that these dark spirits have reanimated, but Elrond puts his nerdy trivia to work by realizing that you need to use the Barrow-wights' own entombed weapons against them, and he even says, according to the lore, which is just so perfect. Arondir, Isildur, and Estrid go out looking for Theo, and Estrid proves her loyalty despite her burned over mark of Adar by saving them from the mud. And it's another example of the power of trees, branches, and gans. Estrid uses this stick to free them, but she ends up just prodding this mudworm. Arondir is able to cut himself out, and he says,
there are nameless things in the deep places of this world. This one you shall call supper.
It's such a cool line, but it's also another example of the ancient things of this world not always having names, like the Stranger, or Tom calling himself just Eldest. The Gund recognizes the name of Sadik Burrows as a descendant of Rory Mas Burrows from the stores.
He dreamed one night of a place with endless streams of cold water and rolling hills so soft, family could dig an hole and live in it in less than a month. He called it the Suzat.
The Suzat is another name for the Shire. So this series is explaining the origin of the Shire, and I really love this idea that it's really kind of a biblical promised land for these wandering tribes. And by the time we meet Bilbo and Frodo there, they're really basking in this land of milk and honey. Galadriel touches Nenya and experiences a vision. So let's break down everything we see in these few seconds. Sauron is grabbing his three-pointed crown. Then that is Elrond being held by orcs with a knife to his throat. And then, whoa, the courtyard of Eregion, while orcs are toppling the statue of Feanor. Over on the right, I'm pretty sure that's Gil-galad and Elrond being forced to watch this. Then Celebrimbor falls on his face, and then Sauron, back in a darker-haired Mordor-flavored Halbrand look, is looking down at Galadriel. I'm pretty sure we're hearing Bear McCreary's Last Temptation track here, which includes Halbrand's theme. So Galadriel is being corrupted with confusion between a possible future and destiny, like between a worst-case scenario or the one fated path that she is walking down and forcing her life into. And Pelargir, we meet Ents. The one with blooms is the Ent wife, Winterbloom, voiced by Olivia Williams, and the male is Snaggleroot, voiced by Jim Broadbent. Ent wives, you say? By the Third Age, Treebeard said that Ent wives had disappeared after leaving their Ent husbands, so it's unclear what happened to them between now and then, but maybe they were destroyed by Sauron after setting up a new forest, or maybe they just were betrayed by their Ent husbands and walked away. And that's kind of what Forgiveness Takes an Age is kind of hinting at. Arondir says,
I am Arondir of the Greenwood.
This might suggest that Arondir is from Greenwood the Great, which would justify why he speaks Sindarin when he's calming down Winterbloom and apologizing. Now, he did say he was born in Beleriand, but maybe after it sank, he was raised in the Greenwood. Winterbloom responds,
Forgiveness takes an age.
And again, I just love this line because it speaks to how long it will take Ents to trust creatures like this again later on in the Third Age. And it also just speaks to the deeper themes of the show. Like, is forgiveness possible? Is change possible? Yeah, but like it takes an age, and really only characters who live that long are capable of ultimately realizing forgiveness. Like, you know, elves, Numenorians descended from elves, and things like Ents and Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil forgives all of us. And they explain what they consider peace to be. And again, I just love this language.
It is what comes after the night storms, when the dawn is silent and the birds awaken. When the only sound here was the light upon the moss.
We definitely feel a parallel with the Eldest, Tom Bombadil, who remembers ancient times when there was just light and then darkness was kept at bay. And when they are able to recover Theo, Arondir calls him Lord of Pelargir. And if that's a title that sticks, it could put Theo on a course to become one of these royal figures like the Ringwraiths. Now we see the orcs' warpath on the map as they fell trees, and the ink of those trees gets erased from the map. That's such a cool detail. Nenya is able to heal the arrow wound, and she hands the ring to Elrond while she faces the orc. And the action is so smooth here. Galadriel snatches a torch and then uses it to turn her arrows into flaming ones all in one motion. And then a little bit after this, she throws a lantern up into the air and then splits it with an arrow to rain fire down on these orcs. But she gets knocked off her horse, and then Adar extinguishes her arrow, and he says this. Whoa! So Adar just called Galadriel Altariel, which is the Quenya name that her husband Celeborn gave her, and she loved so much that she referred to herself as Galadriel, the Sindarin version of the same name. And Celeborn is not on this show, and they've never had a good reason for why he's not on the show. So what does it mean that Adar calls her that here? Is it like a possible term of endearment? Is it possible that he called her that in maybe just a mocking way because she's wearing her hair wrapped in a crown like this? But equally important are the words, a star shines on the hour of our meeting, or as he says in quenya, ella sila lumen omen tielvo, because these words are also spoken by Frodo when he meets the elf Gildor in Fellowship. But really the phrase comes up in a letter that Tolkien wrote to his son, saying that a fan once asked him what Lord of the Rings was really about, if it was an allegory. And Tolkien said that he was just trying to create a situation where elan sila lumen omen tielvo, which would be a common greeting. So from that, people have inferred that maybe Lord of the Rings was just an exercise for Tolkien's love of language. Even though, Tolkien, I don't care what you think. You lived through the 2 world wars. You watched your son go off to war in World War II. The Eagles were the Americans. I think it's okay for us to take away your authorial intent and say that that story is actually about World War II. But if you ask Tolkien, this was his way into his own story. He was a linguist. He loved language. He loved the sound of words and just putting them together in beautiful ways. And that's why he's one of the most significant writers of all of the English language. And I will say that this series, despite its faults, despite it being perhaps a vanity project by one of the awful billionaires of our lifetimes, at the end of the day, it's okay for us to love the work that got produced, despite people who funded it. Because I think what JD and Patrick have created is an exercise in love for what Tolkien loved. This show is beautiful to look at, beautiful to listen to, beautiful to read into the poetry of, even if it doesn't always work as compelling TV drama, because not all those who wander or wonder are lost. Okay, season 2, episode 5, Halls of Stone. The misty mountains cross-dissolve into the exact contour of the blue gem housed in the Ring of Thror. King Durin III's huge fingers drop in to grab it, and with the detail on each of these fingers and these well-manicured fingernails, it's kind of like a giant's hand is pinching the tip of the mountain itself, as bearing this ring probably makes this king feel pretty godly. So the Ring of Thror, as it will one day be known, is the most well-known of the 7 dwarf rings, the first forged by Celebrimbor, and the one most written about in the lore. The Ring of Thror got its name from Thror, a dwarven king in the Third Age who would go on to inherit this ring. When Durin III takes this ring here, he hears some disembodied whispers. It's kind of like the rings themselves are kind of whispering and conspiring against him, as these 6 other dwarven kings will be doing in the days ahead. It's so tragic when you think back on the scene based on what Durin later tells his son in the finale.
I never let you lift your hand. It's you. Just you. Getting stronger.
So Durin adding this ring to his one ringless finger was motivated in part out of fear that his son would one day become stronger than him. Durin learns a lesson all fathers must learn, the burden of all masters. We are what they grow beyond. Now, Sauron was not able to affect the dwarves directly, even when they were wearing the rings. He was only able to do this to men. However, the dwarven rings would lead to the downfall of these wearers anyway by amplifying their greed, resulting in the amassing of treasure. The treasure Smaug sits upon in the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit. This was a treasure that he stole from Thror. In the lore, the elves didn't make a second batch of 7 rings for dwarves and then 9 for humans, but rather they just kind of made all 19 for themselves, 16 with Anatar's help, and then 3 later in secret. When Sauron made the one ring, the elves were immediately aware of him and took off their rings. That's when Sauron attacked Eregion and stole the 15 of the rings. 1 was hidden in Khazad-dûm, and 3 were crafted in secret by Celebrimbor. Sauron then distributed these rings to the dwarves and men basically as a plan B after Corrupt All the Elves failed. But I like this show's adaptation change to make each batch kind of separate for different races, because we get to see how the craftings are really the result of Sauron's increasing layers of manipulation on Celebrimbor, that old softy, and basically Sauron's cunning appeal to Celebrimbor's pride and to his artistry. Durin follows the ring's whisper to dig through a foundation wall, but he says this:
It's not every need. It's light.
In a past episode this season, we saw how that light beaming from the outside from the direction of Mordor toward Khazad-dûm to show how even light can be a deceptive element and can make you think that you don't need to breathe. King Durin says,
Pity those who dwell above, slaves to the sun, chained to its ceaseless rhythm of waking and sleep.
It's such an interesting way to judge races like the elves and humans and even the Harfoots, who set the course of their lives to the cycle of the sun and to the stars. It's almost like a diss to Elrond's father, right? Arendil, who is like currently bringing stars across the sky. That's like his job now. In Eregion, Narvi unveils the famous Doors of Durin. These look pretty similar to the ones that lead to the Mines of Moria in Fellowship of the Ring, just different enough to avoid any kind of like legal issues with what the show is allowed to adapt from Tolkien's estate. In the show, they say the door is guarded by a password known only to friends, which of course is a reference to the riddle on the doors of Durin that reads, "Speak friend and enter," to which the answer is Melon, or friend in Sindarin. Anatar Sauron tries to convince Celebrimbor to make rings for men, and in this conversation he says this:
I fear Numenor.
More than any land in Middle-earth.
Those familiar with the lore know what Sauron's future with Numenor really holds, but this line also links to a line from The Two Towers, where Gandalf tells Aragorn that Sauron fears him because he's the heir of Numenor and a growing symbol as a leader of men. Annatar mentions a few human heroes.
There are always some who rise forth and shine. Eärendil, Tuor, Beren, son of Barrick.
Yes, Eärendil, our old friend who we just mentioned, the first hero Tolkien created for the universe. He's half elf, not fully human, Elrond's father. And it's just kind of interesting that the first one he mentions is an example of someone who's not even like just purely human hero. Eärendil helped end the War of Wrath in the First Age and was fated to travel the sea for eternity with one of the Silmarils. Tuor is Eärendil's human father and became one of the few humans to be granted immortal life in Valinor. Beren is one of the few humans that had a relationship with an elf, along with Tuor and later on Aragorn, of course, with Liv Tyler. But Beren stole a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown, and his actions inspired further rebellion against Morgoth. He too would later be given a second life in Valinor. Sauron has a personal history with Beren, as he actually captured him at one point and killed his companion Finrod. So he's sort of saying, well, find someone as good as this guy who I captured previously. He's implying that Celebrimbor can help create a whole new age of human heroes who will be partners with elves. Annatar Sauron says that from Numenor to Rhûn, they must identify 9 human ring bearers. And I just like this detail because, you know, the 9 ring wraiths were derived from both Numenorians and from Easterlings. And these are the suspects that we're gonna have to keep an eye on in this series. Any kind of young asshole from either Numenor or from Rhûn is probably gonna be one of these guys, plus Theo, we think. Now we should note that Eregion is home to the Noldor elves. These are the elves that never went west to live in Valinor, and so they were never fully at peace in their hearts. So when Sauron gave them the idea that they could create rings of power to bring the light of Valinor to them, it was just a very novel idea. Celebrimbor initially refuses to craft rings for men, somewhat out of snobbery, but Annatar manipulates him the way you can manipulate any kind of workaholic artist. Oh, no problem, I'll do it, and then I'll do a really bad job with it so that you can't help but take over later. In Numenor, Pharazôn points out the White Tower of Eressëa, the gateway to the Undying Lands. So Eressëa was an island initially used by the Valar to ferry the elves from Middle-earth to Valinor. However, the island later became parked off the coast of Valinor and was just barely visible from Numenor. Pharazôn, who is jealous of the elves' immortal souls, thinks the tower is taunting him as the elves forbade the people of Numenor to sail west of Valinor. Pharazôn tells his son Clemons that he would come to ill ends, but makes him help out with decommissioning the Sea Guard that are loyal to Miriel before he will tell him what his mother said would happen to him. It's a lot like Isildur. Clemons is also motivated by the loss of his mother and really the fear of his own fate. My money is definitely on Clemons being one of those asshole human ring bearers who will become ring wraiths. He's just a dick, and you know, someone's gotta be the ring wraiths. Elendil speaks to the deposed Miriel, who places her hand on Elendil's chest throughout the scene to feel his heartbeat. He tells her what the Palantir showed him when he touched it in the past episode, riding away from the city as he will have to flee by the end of the season. Miriel realizes it didn't show him her nightmarish vision of Tolkien's Great Wave swallowing Numenor, so she thinks it could be a sign important that she shouldn't be queen, and that, hey, maybe that fate was averted. Ultimately, with a Palantir, all roads lead to Sauron. Clemons and Eärien force the Sea Guard loyal to the Queen Regent to resign, and we get kind of a Dead Poet Society, oh Captain, my Captain moment, while they all salute Elendil, and Clemons prickishly snaps at everyone to stop. Clemons also flashes a bit of jealousy when Eärien grabs Valandil's arm. Oh, that arm. In Lindon, Gil-galad has another vision, and in it, we see an explosion sending chunks of rock flying, fish gasping for breath. These images come back in episode 7 when the orc army dams the river around Eregion. We see Sauron's crown, which originally was Morgoth's crown before it was reforged, and we see a flaming figure, which I think could be Sauron's true form, as described by Mirdania later when she puts on the ring and goes into the unseen world. Disa prunes the tree that was gifted to this married couple by Elrond. The light from the king's hole in the foundation wall reached this tree, but it doesn't look any healthier because light is not always good. Like Celebrimbor, Disa is another artist who honed her craft over decades, and her discipline causes her to distrust these shortcuts that the rings provide. She and Prince Durin go tune and crystal shopping, and we learn the king has raised the taxes. She drops this crystal and it rolls.
Owl's beard.
Aule was a Vala known as the Smith of the Valar and appreciated especially by the dwarves. This is kind of a variant of the expression Odin's beard. Disa hears a growling in the distance, of course the Balrog, who we'll see in episode 8, and its return frequency causes the water in this cavern pond to ripple upward. I don't think this is the same pond that Gandalf and the Balrog fall into at the beginning of Two Towers, but I assume it could be connected through some linked waterway. King Durin III invites emissaries from the other dwarven kingdoms, offering the other rings for half of their treasure, and he tells Narvi,
should be delving much deeper.
It kind of sets up Saruman's line in Fellowship.
The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. You know what they awoke in the darkness of Khazad-dûm. Shadow and flame.
And Eregion, Celebrimbor finds Myrddania wearing a ring, and she describes her experience from the unseen world.
It was tall, and its skin was made of flames. I saw its eyes, pitiless and eternal.
She's obviously describing Sauron's true form, but only at the mention of his eyes does he cut her off. He's like, the eye of me is the most important part of me. She says, it's been here among us all along. Of course, describing Sauron's disguise as Halbrand/Anatar, but she might also be referring to the fact that Sauron was really alive before the creation of this universe as one of the lesser Maiar created by Iluvatar as spirits to begin the world. These imperfect rings might be the many lesser rings that were forged in the process of creating the rings of power mentioned by Gandalf in the Fellowship text. Sauron would later collect many of these lesser rings, though many were just lost. And I just like the detail that we get to see a lot of these lesser rings being created and just tossed in a scrap pile. But I think Myrddania seeing this form, this true form of Sauron, is why he forces Celebrimbor to kill her in the most grisly death of the series in episode 7. For now, he sets her at ease by saying the fire she saw was Celebrimbor's true form, and then compliments her by comparing her to the likeness of Lady Galadriel. Back in Numenor, a priest for the faithful says,
"Until we meet again in the far green country under a swift sunrise."
This quote comes from the Return of the King text when Frodo sees Valinor for the first time, and it's described as a far green country after a swift sunrise. For the films, Peter Jackson and Fran and Philippa reassigned this quote to Gandalf in that great moment with Pippin in Gondor.
The grey rain curtain of this world rolls back, and all turns to silver glass. And then you see it. White shores, and beyond, a far green country, and a swift sunrise.
And yes, it's always been curious to me that Gandalf would even know what that journey would look like. Presumably, it's just a process that Elrond and Galadriel might have shared with him based off of their knowledge of the lore. But you know, he is also a wizard. He might just have some divine insight when he says that to Pippin. But I've always loved this quote. It's such a beautiful sentiment for any seafaring captain who just might find themselves wandering or wandering at sea. And I just love that they repurpose this as a prayer. The shells that they, remember, placed upside down on the grave of Tar Palantir, they now turn to face up to form floating candles as just a prayer for hope. But Kemen ruins it. He plans to pave over this shrine for what? A new aqueduct, he says. Aqueducts. What Isildur and Pelargir bragged about as being a technological marvel of Numenor that he couldn't wait to get back to is now really just a completely unnecessary destructive force that really recalls the way Roman aqueducts and lead-poisoned water that they carried helped contribute to the fall of Rome. This poor priest wants to save the statue of this weeping figure. I said this was Nienna before, and I think that's even more the case in this scene. Kemen drops it and smashes it on purpose, suggesting the souls that Nienna was weeping for will be lost, which in Elendil's mind would include his late wife and Isildur, who he still thinks is dead. Elendil defends Elendil's armor with a nasty fight with Kemen, and Kemen tries to drown him. I don't know how he overwhelmed those arms, but Elendil gets to his feet and he breaks Kemen's arm. Aryan ain't grabbing that affectionately, but does not kill him at Elendil's orders, and yet, stabby, stabby, stab. Kemen gets a punk stab, not unlike the punk unhealable wound one of the ring wraiths gives Frodo at Weathertop in Fellowship. Anatar Sauron convinces Celebrimbor that the problems with the Dwarven rings came from the fact that they were crafted under the cloak of deception, as Gil-galad did not sanction them and Celebrimbor wrote that the forge was inactive. So the successful appeal to finally get Celebrimbor to craft the 9 is not concern for human suffering, but as a bit of personal shame to the artist. That craftsmanship done with dishonesty leads to a flawed product. So the overall project is incomplete. Okay, next, season 2, episode 6. Where is he? Arondir finds a few orcs complaining about Adar making them chase a ghost. I like any moment that gives some more grouchy nuance to the orcs, which sets them up to mutiny Adar by the season's end, even if that mutiny is really in support of that very ghost. We transition from the orcs map of Eregion to the city's tower. Celebrimbor says,
Why do you still defy me? You who live not, breathe not, possess not mind, nor will? What pride is woven in your inmost self, that you resist my hand?
I think there's a bit of Shakespearean iambic rhythm there. Ye rings of men, why do you still defy me? You who live not, breathe not, possess not mind or will. And of course, Celebrimbor is referring to the unwieldy stubbornness of men themselves. He tosses the ring on the scrap pile beside, a mouse that he will later use to deduce the reality loop that Sauron puts him in. Anatar Sauron addresses Celebrimbor's workers beside this statue of Feanor, Celebrimbor's grandfather, holding one of the Silmarils he crafted. So that means every day, Celebrimbor goes outside. This grandson has to stand in the shadow of his far more accomplished grandfather. Sauron will use this later in the episode.
Best Feanor. Best yourself.
So an elf soldier returns dead, scarred with Kurth runes. Kurth is a character system that Tolkien invented, originally used by elves speaking in Sindarin, but later replaced by the written language of Tengwar, which is better known as a beautiful elvish script. These runes seem to spell out Manas Einir, which I assume is black speech for the title of this episode, which Sauron says here.
What did it say?
Where is he?
Now, if it isn't black speech, that would mean Adar carved these words in the chest specifically for Sauron. So I'm wondering, why would he say, where is he? I think Sauron might have actually changed exactly what was said when translating it for Myrddania. Like, it really could have been, where are you? Or I see you, or fuck you, Sauron, I know you're cosplaying as a pretty boy god to trick those elves. And Sauron just didn't want Myrddania to suspect him. Ooh, what a dinner. Adar tells Galadriel that her obsession with finding Sauron has wormed its way inside her mind.
His eye bores a hole, and the rest of him slithers in. For a while, he even makes you believe that his power has become yours.
We get a reference to the Eye of Sauron, and I like how this scene conceives of the eye as the abstract concept that Tolkien conceived it as opposed to the physical, fiery eye atop the tower that Peter Jackson made it out to be. Nothing wrong with that visual, I freaking love it. It was awesome looking, but Tolkien really wrote of the eye closer to how Adar describes it here. It's like a concept, a vibe that Sauron is always looking at you. They also express Sauron's influence in terms of color here.
An ocean of color, against which everything else feels forever thereafter.
A dull gray.
We might be getting a glimpse into the unseen world, a way for our minds to process overwhelming new perception. We're also reminded of that gray rain curtain followed by a green country under a swift sunrise. Our mortal world, even with all its vibrancy, is really just considered gray in comparison to what lies beyond our event horizon. Galadriel says,
What help could you possibly provide, Orc?
Uruk.
Adar corrects Galadriel on Uruk again, and notice that Galadriel will use Uruk for the rest of the season. She's capable of learning. Uruk is really the species' self-referential term, while in the Third Age, Uruk-hai referred to the stronger forms that was specifically bred by Saruman. Adar says that there are many stories about Morgoth's crown, but that Sauron refired it to fit himself. In the original lore, Morgoth's crown was reforged into a collar around his neck that the chains were affixed to, but Peter Jackson's team designed Sauron's crown to look like John Howe's paintings of Morgoth's pointed crown, so this whole many stories line is kind of a meta wink to those adaptations. Adar's short-term alliance with Galadriel is one of the most interesting moves on the series. The orcs are his children, and he doesn't want his family following a manipulative master who views them as disposable. And he knows that the elves' forge in Eregion is like the worst weapon in the wrong hands, so he's like, I gotta destroy this. In his eyes, he's really targeting like a Manhattan Project Los Alamos site. He remembers what Pandora's box looked like open to the Silmarils in the previous age, and he doesn't want another one opened. The Rings of Power as a series is just such a good story about what happens when the same people fail to apply historical lessons just out of pride, or being too deferential, or just paralyzed by fear in the face of obvious evil. Elendil finds himself in a kind of Eddard Stark Game of Thrones scenario, forced to confess treason and bend the knee while his Sansa Stark type daughter watches along, but Elendil ends his confession more like Tyrion Lannister during his trial in season 4. But because this is Rings of Power and not Game of Thrones, Elendil is not bloodily executed right then and there. Also because, he's got important stuff to do later on in history. Like Tyrion, it's decided the gods will decide his fate. In this case, a sea creature, and like Tyrion, with a champion. But that, champion doesn't get his head imploded by the mountain. On to Gandalf, as we will now officially call him with the knowledge of the reveal from the finale episode. The speculation in the first half of this video, oh so cute, but it was recorded before I saw the finale episode, but the clues were pretty obvious. Gandalf has a nightmare vision of the events of the finale, the Dark Wizard's destruction of the Store Village in episode 8, events that will give him his staff. Even in this vision, as the boulders fall, beyond them you can see the specific constellation this wizard has been seeking. Tom Bombadil says,
The secret fire whispers to us.
This secret fire is the heavenly power of the creation of Iluvatar. It's all in the Ainur. All that fire is in the Ainur, including the wizards. In Fellowship, Gandalf tells Balrog that he was the wielder of the Flame of Anor. Tom Bombadil tells Gandalf that he has to choose between following his path to recover his power or saving his friends. This is kind of a classic step in the hero's journey. Like, the hero kind of just has to go off and hang out with a weirdo for a bit. Luke Skywalker meeting the eccentric, wise creature Yoda on Dagobah in Empire. Luke wants to save Han and Leia, but Yoda says if he leaves, he'll never finish his training to become a Jedi. But by the end of the season, we learn that Tom Bombadil really wanted Gandalf to save his friends all along, because that rescue is what led to him acquiring his Gand, or, I guess his magic stick, his lightsaber. It's all the same thing, metaphorically. With Nori, Gund calls her home a Smiel, which is the Hobbit word for Hobbit hole. Tolkien based that word on an Old English word, Smigel, which means a burrow or a place to creep into. And I'm betting that's where Smeagol came from as well, as obviously Gollum was the Hobbit Smeagol before he was Gollum. Gund says says that I've been tending to that tree since I was big enough to balance a rake, and we learn that that tree is where her soulmate is buried and where she will be buried, making it another sacred tree. Let's go! This, of course, will produce the broken branch that will form Gandalf's staff. And looking at the shot, I kind of feel like it's that Highlights magazine hidden picture where you're just like looking at everything to be like, oh, it's kind of in that shape. So I think the Gond is that one. Like, I kind of feel like the knob at the end of that one is a knob that you could stuff a pipe into for safekeeping. That's like my favorite detail about Gandalf's staff. He like can stuff his pipe into it and just like keep his pipe right there for him to be like, oh, what? No, I'm good. I'm good. Tom Bombadil says,
Many that die deserve life. Some that live deserve death. Who are you to give it to them?
Ah, yes, one of the famous Gandalf quotes from Fellowship, the Pity of Bilbo passage. 'Twas pity that stayed Bilbo's hand. A passage about how you never know what sparing a single life can do to alter the fate of even creatures seemingly most deserving of death. We see how this Gandalfian wisdom now is just rooted in old Tom Bombadil, an unknowingly ancient spirit. In Khazad-dûm, the gold hoard that Smaug will later rub his old belly up on begins to be piled up. Annatar Sauron arrives to offer timber for Mithril, which timber would require trees, my friend. Precious trees to be cut down Fangorn style. And we met some friendly Ents earlier in the season who would have a word with that. Durin the Elder and Younger tell this guy to F off, and he just kind of looks in the fires of the nearby torch. I think he's remembering the Balrog that is below this kingdom and kind of just like tapping on his door. But notice how he smartly takes no for an answer. Sauron is always willing to take the L in the short term because it leaves the window of opportunity open for a longer term victory. Disa takes an active stand against Durin III's refusal to take off the ring and to keep delving, including her summoning of bats. It's a fun bit of parallelism with the men of Numenor blowing the horns to summon the sea worm, but when you summon fauna to serve you, you have to be prepared for their neutrality or for it to go against you. Back in Numenor, that's what we see. Miriel volunteers as tribute for Elendil's place in the trial of the sea worm and sucked down into the pool by this kraken-like creature. Miriel becomes something of an Andromeda on the rocks figure, scapegoated to face the wrath of the sea. But in Miriel's case, her apocalyptic great wave dread now tips in her favor. The nudging of the sea on this season initially comes off as a force of good, but since it places all of Numenor on its doomed path, I just don't trust the waves, I don't trust the light, I only trust the trees. Pharazôn goes on to use the Palantir and sees Mount Doom and Halbrand, whom he met last season. Anytime they use the Palantir, I love this visual effect of the cracking of reality itself that feels like an abrupt version of the gray rain curtain gently rolling back, something closer to the visual of Durin III cracking the foundation wall to get exposed to a vibrant light that you're not really meant to have access to. The siege of Eregion begins, and it's a bit different from the lore. For one, Sauron was not in the city by the time the siege started, but rather was leading it, and Annatar had been found out 100 years before the siege, but it's just one of many examples of the timeline being condensed. Also, the One Ring was crafted by this point in the lore. However, parts of it are very accurate. For instance, in the Unfinished Tales, Tolkien wrote that Celebrimbor makes his last stand on the steps of the Jewelsmith's Guild House. Similarly, in this show, Celebrimbor's final stand in episode 8 is exactly in this spot. Sauron uses his illusion magic to make Celebrimbor see just a peaceful Eregion, and when Celebrimbor goes back inside, the spell ends, and we stay on this shot of Charlie Vickers as we realize that we are in the midst of chaos. And it changes from day to night, and I initially assumed VFX were involved in this, but no. You can see in the BTS footage where they actually did this transition practically with things like shifting the lighting, the torches now igniting off camera, and swapping out different extras, all while the camera was turned away from that part of the set. It's so cool how they pulled this off. And we get another incredible shot as we glide from Sauron's gaze over the battlements, over to the tree line across the river, where we see Adar's forces being amassed. Galadriel clutches her rings, and we end with the fireballs gliding over into Eregion and blinding us. And the final frame, fire consumes us. The fire that Sauron was looking at in Khazad-dûm, the same light that he's using to blind all of these characters to the obvious, he is now blinding us. We're blinded by the light. Season 2, episode 7, Doomed to Die. A title coming from the Ringverse poem on the One Ring, 9 for mortal men doomed to die. And those are the first spoken words of this episode by Celebrimbor.
9 for mortal men.
But it's not only mortal men who are doomed, most of these characters are doomed, as the forging of these rings and the siege outside will only really lead to one place. These opening shots represent a false piece, the Eye of the Storm, or really the Eye of the Sauron, you could say, with unnaturally vibrant colors and blinding light, shot like a Folgers commercial, as Celebrimbor sips his morning drink and scoops out some coffee bean-esque mithril to roast his brew. And when Celebrimbor seals one of these bands, a flash of white blinds us to signal an evil little kiss from the Maiar. You even kind of hear a siren choir song, vocals of the Ainur singing behind it. Celebrimbor has been using Feanor's hammer in his work. This is a tool his grandfather used to craft the Silmarils, but notices a ruby is missing from the handle. And I love that a missing jewel from its setting is really the first glitch of this matrix that he notices, because it recalls one of Feanor's jewels, the Silmaril, pried from the crown of Morgoth. And while tugging at this suspicion, he finds Mr. Mouse, who crawls past and then reaches up a few times before just continuing on his cycle. And then he sees his true reflection in the mirror. It's a kind of mirror, mirror on the wall / picture of Dorian Gray type of reveal. This episode even using a crossing mouse as the reveal of this loop recalls the Black Cat glitch in the Matrix, as well as Truman Burbank in The Truman Show, noticing the passing cars and pedestrians and their loop, or even really the playback loop of the bus footage in Speed. The fact that it is a mouse that breaks the cycle also recalls the ever-famous Avengers Endgame rat that freed Scott Lang from the quantum realm, by extension saved the universe. Celebrimbor says that he's been in this state for weeks. I'm reminded of the classic fables like The Sorcerer's Apprentice, of using magical shortcuts to be able to toil your way through the night. Or if you love musicals like I do, The Story of Shmuel, the Tailor of Klimovich from Jason Robert Brown's The Last 5 Years. The tailor who got his wish granted to freeze time during a night and finally be able to work his artistry free from distraction or exhaustion. But the magic of meddling with time like this always incurs a cost. Sauron strolls out on the Eregion battlements unworried about the raining assault, like freaking Gus Fring stepping out into sniper fire. Sauron lies to say Celebrimbor has cowardly ordered no counterattack, and he takes command now, telling Myrddania,
"When the time comes, I will see to it that you are duly rewarded."
You can tell he's already planning on sacrificing her to frame Celebrimbor. The orc army dams the river. Now in season 1, the Southlanders redirected water flow to cause Mount Doom to explode back into its active volcano state. Once again, the Great Wave always spells doom for characters, doesn't it? Elrond appeals to Durin and Disa for aid, and he finds that they've been maintaining the tree that he gave them, so he knows that there's still hope from his old friend. And Durin calls Elrond tidal-haired, referring to the curls of his hair, but also recalling that Elrond descends from the seafaring Arendil. Meanwhile, Adar's Uruk's charge across the muddy riverbed is truly a brutal war of attrition, recalling Helm's Deep from Two Towers, and we stay grounded in a character's point of view, in this case of Myrddania, so that the editing toggles between a wide scale of the battle with all these extras, and then these little anecdotal inserts in which Myrddania would just notice the orcs plowing ahead despite arrows going into their legs. The way Celebrimbor says, "Wait for it," noticing the path of the mouse, is exactly how Truman tells his wife to wait for the passing cars in The Truman Show. He sounds crazy, but this guy's actually totally been red-pilled. Anatar / Sauron reveals this trickery.
I am the one keeping the storm at bay, balancing the very sun above your head, all to give you this one chance to prove your worth.
Manipulation of sunlight recalls King Durin bringing the sun to us to break free of the cycles of day and night. But really controlling nature like this is not ever good. It's Celebrimbor's grandfather's Feanor's hammer that breaks the window glass and finally reveals the battle cries from the outside. Whereas the Palantir shattered reality from its grayness to color, this shatters in the opposite direction, from artificial technicolor on the inside to the gray, muddy reality outside. In another amazingly smooth transition, Celebrimbor staggers out upon the balcony, unblemished initially, and then the camera pans away from him to show the destruction down below, and then in the same shot, we pan back to Celebrimbor, and he is dirty and bloodied now, and we follow him back into his workshop to reveal it is a smoldering mess. Celebrimbor realizes that the mithril he had been using to form the Nine are actually some of Sauron's black goo that he molded into his human Halbrand form in the season 2 premiere. So this liquid on Celebrimbor's fingers is like this guy. Ugh. But if you think about this in the context of the creation of the 9 rings for men, it would suggest that they were not crafted from mithril, but rather just from Sauron's buried blood, which is pretty gnarly, and it explains why the 9 kings were more directly influenced by Sauron and devolved into the Nazgul. Celebrimbor, feeling shaken from having Sauron's goo on his fingers, wanders outside to see a dog sadly sniffing at its dead owner. We do thankfully see this pup doing okay in the finale in Rivendell, so this dog's gonna be fine. We see how the elves' cultural upbringing of associating clean, polished beauty as truth blinds Myrddania and the others when it comes to trusting Sauron versus Celebrimbor. Like, Celebrimbor comes off as this bloody lunatic raving about candles and Mr. Mouse. He just can't be trusted over this calm, clean, angelic ideal who told Myrddania that she reminded him of Galadriel. Sauron raises his palm to deceive them with red blood, a kind of Christ stigmata pose, painting himself as just a sacrificial scapegoat, an ultimate hero. But with a flick of the same hand, Sauron uses a residual goo that was on Celebrimbor's fingers to puppet that hand to throw poor Myrddania off the battlement. Within seconds, an orc is like, hey, and decapitates her. For anyone who gripes that the Rings of Power is too soft to be high fantasy in their minds, just know that HBO and Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon have deceived you into thinking all high fantasy must be washed with constant excessive violence and sex. And I have to say that this death right here breaks our hearts in just the right way without being too excessive to make it more effective dramatically than most of the deaths that happen in like the latter seasons of Game of Thrones and all the deaths we've seen in House of the Dragon. Because it certainly felt crueler and more dramatically justified than Cersei killing Missandei in a similar way in the penultimate episode of Game of Thrones final season. It hurts. I hate to see Mordania go through that, but like this is what it should be. Elrond leads the Elvish cavalry with Gil-galad at his side, and he shouts, "Death to our foes," in Sindarin. There's a great overhead shot where the elves charge in like an arrow, carrying the sunlight across the battlefield into the shadow where the line of orcs are. Mud kicks up on the camera as we're following the gallop. Feels great, but then Adar unveils the captive Galadriel, blood drawn from her throat, and Elrond commands a halt, which is impressive training for all these horses and riders, and Elrond's ability to project his voice, that all these riders and horses just stop at once. Adar tells Elrond to trust him to wipe out Sauron and all of Eregion that's now under Sauron's control.
You have the beauty of your foremother, Melian of the Valar. If even a fragment of her wisdom is in your veins, you must know you cannot defeat me in battle.
So Melian the Maya was an Ainu of the race of the Maiar of Yavanna. So similar to Durin's diss of tidal hair, Elrond is facing less glamorous races mocking the elven beauty as a detriment. Because those who focus on finery and scripture and wisdom and history should know what a coin toss the muddy reality of war truly is. Elrond and Galadriel smooch, so Robert Aramayo was pretty hesitant to film this scene. However, after he discussed it with Morfydd Clark, the two actors went forward with it. From their perspective, the kiss is just entirely strategic, to pass along this class for Galadriel to pick the lock. It's not meant to imply a romance between them. But Morfydd Clark also said that she thought this kiss might be more commonly seen as platonic to elves. That being said, the actors and producers knew what they were doing. As Aramayo said in an interview, that the kiss was intended to be controversial. Now, in the lore, Elrond will go on to marry Galadriel's daughter, Celebrimbor, but Celebrimbor was born at the start of the Second Age, but in Rings of Power, Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, has been completely missing since the First Age, but the producers, I believe, have asked for patience that he's like somewhere in this world. Elrond tells Vorahil and Sindarin so the orcs can understand.
Ernil Durin, Deliatha, o Chathodron Sifwin, Gwawais Nelithing Gwaithin Nagothrim, Anna Eglaini Estuit Uliathogin. We
are reminded of how Gandalf will tell Aragorn that he would arrive at first light with reinforcements in the Battle of Helm's Deep and Two Towers. So this episode really uses our common understanding of Helm's Deep from Peter Jackson's film to set us up to feel hope at the end of it, but really uses that to manipulate us to leave us in such a state of despair as we feel doomed to die. In a big speech, Prince Durin says that Sauron stole the 7 smithing secrets from our forebears. Now, the 7 smithing secrets aren't really known from lore, but I think it's a reference to Aule, the respected smith of the Valar, blasphemed by Disa earlier this season, who in the First Age, Sauron the Maya was trying to curry favor with. So describing Sauron in this particular way would really be an effective way for Durin to rally the dwarves to war. The orc Zor kills Elrond's horse? God, no! And Elrond kills him with one of the most brutal deaths, pinning him to the rocks in the catapult and then saying die in Sindarin and launching him so that his body smacks against the walls of Eregion. There's a really interesting moment where Galadriel, in hooded disguise, tries to sneak out of the Uruk camp and stumbles upon an Uruk funeral pyre, as Adar says. This helps Galadriel on her path towards respecting Uruks as their own nuanced species and connects to the finale episode title Flame and Shadow. Sauron says that he's making Celebrimbor suffer the way Morgoth tortured him and that it was a game between them, a contest of strength. When Morgoth sought to destroy, he says, Sauron sought to perfect. Not only does this give us context of the clear-eyed madness and inhumanity that drives Sauron, it thematically resonates with what we were talking about with Adar, that sometimes the most virtuous thing to do is to just destroy something, because perfecting something can just lead to a cycle of never satisfied meddling and ultimately suffering involved in that perfection process. Adar's not wrong that destroying Eregion is better for Middle-earth overall than allowing the elves and now Sauron to use this forge to perfect weapons of mass destruction. And actually, we'll see in the final episode how Poppy's quoting of Sadoc Burrows in episode 8 completes this argument in a really beautiful way. Sauron says that the difference between himself and Celebrimbor is that Celebrimbor chose to partake in the suffering, that he gave into the folly of the craftsman in pursuit of beauty, even when that cost a sacrifice. Celebrimbor tries tries to melt the 9 rings in the forge, but later learns that they cannot be melted because they don't retain heat like other metal does. Remember Gandalf telling Frodo that the One Ring was quite cool, which is why they had to take the One Ring all the way to the fires of Mount Doom to destroy it. Celebrimbor has to use the metal press that we saw earlier to cut off his thumb to escape the cuffs. Remembering what Sauron said about the torture between Morgoth and Sauron was a test to see whose will was mightier. Galadriel finds Celebrimbor, and both admit that they willingly blinded themselves to what Sauron was offering. Celebrimbor leaves Galadriel with an important message.
Light endures and is mightier than strength. For in its presence, all darkness must flee.
This underscores how important Galadriel's gift to Frodo will be in the Third Age, the light of Erendil, our most beloved star.
May it be a light for you in dark places when all other lights go out.
And Celebrimbor says goodbye with this,
Namari,
which is the Quenya word meaning farewell. Elrond runs into the female elf Rian, who joined Elrond and Galadriel's group back in episode 4, who says that she has enough arrows to do her part, but notice she seems to be out of arrows in her quiver. I think she knows that she's gonna get plugged with orc arrows, and then she yanks one of these out and lights it on fire and ignites a pitch to blow it all up. This leads to the unleashing of the hill troll Damrod, who's voiced by Benjamin Walker, and according to the show's designers, they say he's based visually on Mike Ehrmantraut in Breaking Bad, which feels kind of mean to the actor Jonathan Banks, but when he comes out of the tree line, notice he kicks the catapult really for no reason, just sending its flaming boulders prematurely flying off in another direction. But this is actually smart visually for the VFX artist because it allows light from the fire to illuminate his form so that we can see it from a distance exactly how big he is. Celebrimbor tries to arrest Sauron, but Sauron mind controls a soldier, saying,
"You think it was only you who put yourself in my power."
Now in the lore, Sauron aims to use the rings to control the minds of the elves, but here it seems as though anyone who has willingly submitted themselves to Sauron's authority in whatever form he took is kind of a victim to this sort of influence. Damrod trudges forward, crushing one elf into the mud, biting the head off of an orc, slapping another one, and even setting one corpse ablaze and kind of like bowling it forward. He's just a big old stinker. Arondir and Elrond use the Ravager to slam Damrod in the gut, probably breaking some ribs, but in anger, he slams it further against the wall, cracking it, which, you know, the orcs will take advantage of later. Gil-galad rides up and slashes his leg with a spear. Gil-galad's spear is actually named Aeglos, and he's gonna use it later in the War of the Last Alliance. Together, they're able to bring down Damrod as Arondir tackles him to the ground. It'll be this crew plus Galadriel, whom we end the season with, overlooking the realm that will become Rivendell. But now, with the elven numbers depleted, the sun rises as it did as the dawn crept up on Helm's Deep that morning. But hope is dashed as Vorahil rides up with an arrow in his shoulder to report that Durin's forces are not coming. Elrond cannot accept this.
Durin will come. Durin will come.
Arondir sparks Adar, but definitely dodges an arrow at point blank range, which is awesome. Adar stabs Arondir with what seemed like a deadly blow, but as he walks away, notice that Arondir keeps moving a little bit, so I guess it's the show's way of saying, we don't see the light go out of his eyes, so no death. The orcs breach the walls of Region. Elrond, accepting his fate, is awoken from his fugue state with the sound of a sword, but not a strike, a sheathing, because Adar is here not to kill him, but to humiliate him. He speaks in Sindarin.
I've got a house, sweetie Oros.
So Rumiel was a wise lore master of the Noldor who lived in Valinor. The one thing Adar said Elrond had over him, knowledge of scripture and history and philosophy, Adar is throwing back in his face now. This episode ends with Adar holding Nenya by its chain, and the focus shifts from his face to the ring. In some ways, it's a visual inverse from the opening shot of episode 5, when we shifted from an extreme close-up of the ring of Thror to King Durin III. Now it's from Adar to the ring Nenya. And on to the finale episode, season 2, episode 8, Shadow and Flame. Shadow and Flame are the words we hear from Saruman in the quote from Fellowship that we brought up before, a reference to the Balrog, Durin's bane. King Durin uses his own miniature Ravager to break through the cave wall. On the other side is this cavern full of veins of mithril, created, as we saw in Gil-galad's story in season 1, the Song of the Roots of Hithai by the bolt of lightning striking the tree, fought over by an elf and the Balrog, who then poured their respective magic into it. The Balrog rises, his whip snapping upward from the depths and grasping the king, just as it does to Gandalf in Fellowship. The Balrog is one of the Maiar, which means that only its physical form can be destroyed. In the lore, Durin's bane isn't supposed to be woken until well into the Third Age. It's supposed to get its name by killing a future Durin, not during the third here, but it makes me worried about future Durins. I'll just say that. King Durin removes the ring, and we see that all his fiddling with gold has made his fingernails look pretty gold, but now he comes to his senses, correcting his son, who had thought his father would lift his hand a little bit to let the younger get close to winning, but he said something else was happening.
I never let you lift your hand. It was you. Just you.
getting stronger.
And I have to say here, as someone who in the past year both became a father to a son and lost my own father, I just kind of need to take a second with this line. There's, you know, the one interpretation that I mentioned before that during the Elder might have had that kind of classic aggro dad anxiety. Oh no, my son's gonna overpower me. And he now just has to learn the lesson of we are what they grow beyond, right? But I think there's another interpretation. Like maybe during the Elder truly did lift his hand the way, you know, as a dad, you'll often do to make your kid feel super strong, because it's not about being super strong, it's about feeling super strong. And maybe just in this moment during the Elder tells his son that he was getting stronger because he wants his son to feel strong when he's gone and to believe that he always had that strength. The truth, I think, is that we never really know how strong our dads are or were, because this is also a game they played with their dads, you know, but they probably wondered about that too. But throughout every generation, that contest of strength is ultimately an expression of love. And yeah, I'm fully aware that it's a little silly to get this raw over characters in ridiculous costumes with their fake beards and their prosthetic noses, but you know, also sometimes these kind of over-the-top costumes are where our truest selves can be expressed. So moving on, Gandalf meets the Dark Wizard.
Manwë promised you would come.
So Manwë is the king of the Valar and brother to Melkor, aka Morgoth. The Dark Wizard confirms that he and Gandalf are both Istari and that there are 5 of them. And he says that Gandalf convinced him to come to Middle-earth because they needed to fight Sauron together. It implies that there's some history shared between these characters. Now in the lore, the 5 Istari are Gandalf the Grey, Saruman the White, Radagast the Brown, and the 2 Blue Wizards, Alatar and Palando. The Dark Wizard calls Gandalf old friend, which of course is something Saruman would often call Gandalf. But the showrunners, JD and Patrick, have for now confirmed to Vanity Fair that the Dark Wizard is not Saruman. Now, if he is telling the truth about being an Istar himself, that could suggest that he might be one of the Blue Wizards, Alatar, or Palando. I just kind of feel like the vibes are totally pointing to Saruman, and it's gonna be annoying if these showrunners are lying in these interviews. The lore has multiple takes on when the Istari came to Middle-earth. It's generally accepted that they came in the 3rd Age, but in The Peoples of Middle-earth, Tolkien played with the idea that the Blue Wizards at least came in the 2nd Age, saying they must have had very great influence on the history of the 2nd and 3rd Age and weakening and disarraying the forces of the East. Interestingly, in a video released by Amazon, a Tolkien scholar says that there's really no such thing as canon when it comes to his writings, as his ideas were constantly evolving, and he would often rewrite and change details about the history of the world. The Dark Wizard tells Gandalf to look past your name, your staff, which we could also look at as a clue coming from the Dark Wizard that this guy's gonna be able to derive his name from his staff, is Gand. The Easterling hunter that we now know is named Brank says this.
My people were once kings, wizard.
I feel like Brank is another solid Nazgul suspect. The Dark Wizard smashes the store village, and Gandalf saves his friends by levitating these rocks, and we transition from the stars of the constellation to the tree Nimloth in Numenor, as the sun from the west is illuminating the leaves, making it look a lot like Telperion, the tree that Nimloth was meant to be an embodiment of, suggesting that the light of Gandalf's stars could be coming from the same source, and that source being the Valar. Farazan claims some bullshit to all these faithful leaders that Muriel's miraculous survival from the sea worm must have been a trick that she pulled from Sauron, which is a pretty big stretch based on Farazan's vision in the Palantir. So they use this to banish the faithful from Numenor, and notice that now the leaves of Nimloth break off the branches and float past the statue of Elendil in the harbor, showing how far this kingdom is drifting from the protection of the Valar. Muriel gives Elendil Narsil, the White Flame, of course the sword that will one day be broken and used by Elendil's son Isildur to sever Sauron's fingers and free the One Ring. The way Elendil unsheathes it and flourishes the blade between him and Muriel is totally a parallel to the way Aragorn waves Andúril, the sword that the broken shards of Narsil will be reforged into when Elrond gives it to Aragorn in Return of the King. Now, from here, there's a 90-second tracking shot in Eregion following the barrage and the invading orcs to the few elves remaining to defend it, including this awesome guy who badassly slides down the rooftop and then immediately gets killed. And then finally into the courtyard where Galadriel leads a small group of women into the city. And even Morfydd Clark's stunt there is just, you know, a little basic, but I think it's just because they had to time it perfectly with the way the camera was moving, and they didn't want to do anything too complicated. Sauron savagely fires arrows into Celebrimbor's broken body. Sauron references Gondolin, which was an elven city that fell during the First Age when Morgoth's forces learned of its location and destroyed it. Celebrimbor bitterly taunts Sauron.
For soon I shall go to the shores of the morning, borne hence by a wind that you can never follow.
As a Maiar rejected by the Valar and not among the chosen race of the elves, one of Sauron's sorest points of envy was being denied entry to Valinor. So Celebrimbor is now just trying to humiliate this guy for dressing in the form of an elven angelic spirit. Celebrimbor promises,
the rings of power shall destroy you. One alone shall prove your utter
ruin!
So of course the 19 rings and the One Ring will become both Sauron's victory and his defeat, and then his return to power, and then his final eradication. But we are reminded of the path that Sauron could have taken back in the season 2 premiere after he clawed his way back into life. Choosing treachery and ambition and bloodshed wasn't the only path for him. Sauron spears Celebrimbor and raises him up against the column. This comes from Tolkien's description of Celebrimbor's death in his notes. After refusing to give the location of the rings, his body was riddled with arrows and then paraded around on a pole by Sauron's army as a warning to the other elves. But the way Celebrimbor pronounces Sauron Lord of the Rings, it almost reads like Celebrimbor getting the last laugh, as in a way he's saying being a Lord of the Rings is all that he will ever be master of. So Clemons arrives in Pelargir and immediately starts pinpointing homes to tear down and to build a stupid watchtower. This dude loves bulldozing. Clemons is shocked to see Isildur still alive because with Elendil on the loose with Narsil, the line is still very unbroken. And I love this little moment.
I never gave up hope. Even when everyone said there were no survivors left.
There wouldn't be. If not for Barrick.
Oh, Barrick. He does this bashful little snuff. Like, oh, I didn't do that much. Despite the fact that you fought a whole bunch of fucking spiders, Barrick. Take a moment to run a victory lap. I also really wanted Clemons to be like, is Barrick the name of the horse or the weird ass ram standing in front of him? I really just think they framed this awkwardly with the ram because I think Barrick the horse might have been VFX'd into the shot because that specific gesture might have just been too hard to get in the crowd shot here. Clemons demands a regular allotment of timber to build Pharazôn's armada.
Certain that won't be a problem for you. After all, they're only trees.
Have we learned nothing from the Ents? I'm really looking forward to one of those Ents picking Clemons out of his feet roots. Galadriel is brought before Adar, wherein Ninya has restored his appearance to handsome elvish features. It seems like every time we see Adar with Galadriel, they're shot with these extreme Dutch angles, showing all the vertical lines in the shot bowed strongly toward each other, and might be showing how these two are distant points, both bent toward one mutual end. Adar says that when he was an elf, he was known by another name that he cannot remember, and that Adar was a name he earned, setting up an interesting mystery of what Adar's Elven name was before all this. He moves to the ring and he hands it to Galadriel, and gradually his gray skin just creeps across his face. Adar's son is brought back to him, but Adar is mutinied in the same fashion that Adar did to Sauron in the Furrowed Waif in the season premiere. Gil-galad and Elrond are taken to the Eregion courtyard to see Feanor's statue torn down, which was also from the vision earlier this season. The orcs torch every scroll from Celebrimbor's works, and while from Elrond's point of view, this amounts to a burning of the Library of Alexandria,
The sacred Jedi text!
the loss of centuries of wisdom. In truth, these orcs were following Adar's orders to undo the Manhattan Project, essentially. Arguably, Sauron wouldn't want the forge and the research to survive so that no other rings could be forged to contest the 19 that have been made already, but the fact that after this he will go to Mount Doom to forge the 20th One Ring in secret tells us that he probably would have preferred to keep Celebrimbor's research to build on. Galadriel duels Sauron, who fights her both with a sword and with Morgoth's crown.
But to find the light, we must first touch the darkness.
He is quoting Galadriel's brother Finrod in the line that he told her in the prologue of the series back in season 1.
Sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness.
This just shows how in all these lines, Sauron is totally in her head. And it's because she has let him worm his way into her brain, as she was warned by Adar earlier this season. Next, he conjures himself in his Halbrand form, the form Galadriel saw in her vision back in episode 4.
Fighting at your side, I felt if I could just hold on to that feeling.
And that is another line Halbrand said to her back in season 1.
Fighting at your side, I felt if I could just hold on to that feeling.
Halbrand then passes behind a rock and comes out the other side as a doppelganger Galadriel, which I'm pretty sure they did practically with Morfydd Clark just waiting behind that rock, and a body double in the foreground because they needed a body double anyway when these two were fighting each other in the wide shots. And she says,
"They could no longer distinguish me from the evil I was fighting."
This is also a line Galadriel said in season 1.
Because I believe they could no longer distinguish me from the evil I was fighting.
And then Sauron takes the form of Celebrimbor.
Are they not the seeds you planted?
Yes, calling back Galadriel's dream earlier in the season when she planted those seeds of linden in the Memorial Grove, and then they sprouted into the tree that killed Celebrimbor in that vision, lifting him off the ground. In a similar way, Sauron propped him up in his actual death. Sauron stabs her with the crown.
I would have placed a crown upon your head. I would never have rested until all Middle-earth had been brought to its knees to worship the light of its queen.
Aha! It's a nod to the regal version of Galadriel when she had a really creepy moment with Frodo when he offered her the One Ring in Fellowship.
You would have a queen, not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the dawn. All shall love me and despair.
Sauron speaks to Galadriel telepathically.
Give me your ring,
This was also seen in Return of the King when Celebrimbor and Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf all kind of shared that telepathic group chat. Tolkien actually described this in his text as, "For they did not move or speak with mouth, looking from mind to mind, and only their shining eyes stirred and kindled as their thoughts went to and fro." Sauron takes the nine, but Galadriel, realizing Sauron only wants to heal himself, keeps Nenya. And similar to how Elrond, Dr. Richard Kimbled off the waterfall in Lindon in the season 2 premiere, Galadriel does the same here. Meanwhile, the dwarves, led by Narvi, finally arrive to Eregion and free Elrond and Gil-galad and Arondir and the surviving elves from these orcs, but Glug informs Sauron that the dwarves are covering the elves' retreat and that the orcs are now outnumbered, which comes directly from Tolkien's writings, where the dwarves of Khazad-dûm attack Sauron's forces from the rear, allowing Elrond and his elves to escape. And after that, they would go on to establish Rivendell, which is hinted at the end of this episode when Narvi says that Elrond and his elves found a valley in the north. Gil-galad says that Galadriel's wounds are dragging her spirit to the Shadow Realm. This may be a similar type of wound to the one Frodo received on the Weathertop in Fellowship when he was stabbed by a Morgul knife. That knife, which broke off in Frodo's chest, would have turned him into a wraith had he not been healed by Elrond. And the spell Gil-galad speaks has a similar audio effect to it, this kind of interesting echo to the Elrond spell that Arwen was chanting in Fellowship to summon the river to wipe out the Nazgûl. In the rubble of the Store Village, Nori removes the ribbons from Gun's tree, and this branch is definitely the staff that Gandalf will later pick up to form his Gand. If not for Nori specifically tossing this in the way, he would not have found it, or rather, it would not have found him. Now remember, season 1 ended with Poppy singing Bear McCreary's beautiful lyrics of The Wandering Day over a montage of all the characters, something that stayed with us, Wanderers and Wanderers, for over 2 years. Now, it is this incredible speech by Poppy, quoting Sadoc Burrows, and I'm gonna read the full passage here. She says, "Some things can't be fixed. Some things lost are lost forever. No matter how hard we fight, how much it hurts, or how much our hearts yearn to put them back together. Because this world's so much bigger than any of us, and sometimes the winds blowing against us are just too strong. At those times," Mr. Burrows said, "we've just got to accept it. What's broke is broke and won't fix. And all anybody can do is try to build something new." The prose itself isn't anything special, as it shouldn't be if it's coming from Sadoc and paraphrased by Poppy, but I find the sentiment to be so novel and so appropriate for the times we live in, including the way many of us watch this show. Now, this being the epitaph of the season reminds us in a way of Puck's closing monologue to William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, when he said, "If we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme no more yielding but a dream. Gentles, do not reprehend, if you pardon we will mend, and as I am an honest Puck, if we have unearned luck now to scape the serpent's tongue, we will make amends ere long, else the Puck a liar call, so good night unto you all. Give me your hands if we be friends, and Robin shall restore amends." Because it's quite common in stories to end with this kind of sentiment of all things being mended, everything being fixed, order being restored, but that's not Tolkien. Tolkien understood that sometimes the world just gets too broken, that you cannot go home again. Frodo's wound never heals, and he has to leave Middle-earth behind to Valinor. So what wisdom does this season leave us with? What's broke is broke and won't fix, and all anybody can do is try to build something new. And in the words, "Because this world's so much bigger than any of us, and sometimes the winds blowing against us are just too strong," I kind of find a meta statement to the way these writers might feel about the fandom, or really, I should say, the online crosswinds blowing strongest against this series. It is impossible to please everyone who has an opinion on the Rings of Power. That battle is lost. There exists a growing mirror world of very bitter voices who use streaming series like this as like poster targets for their rage. And while it can be tempting to quote tweet and clap back at them to try to mend that divide, you're not gonna win that way. You're not gonna win fighting them on their turf. The world is too big, the winds are too strong. Really, the way forward is just to accept that the world is broken and just build something new. Because you building something new is a way that you're actually going to fix the world. Build a new world. Don't try to fix the broken world. Also, an interesting visual detail in the editing, over the words "what's broke is broken won't fix," the camera focuses on Elendil's sword of Narsil, the sword that will one day be broken, but in its brokenness actually forge something new that actually does the job, and will of course be reforged in a new form, a new sword that this lineage, when it's completed, will sanctify. And over the words "all anybody can do is try to build something new," we ironically see a shot of Sauron holding Feanor's hammer, clearly plotting to forge his own One Ring in secret. But that building something new also also applies to Gandalf, who from the rubble of the Store Village and the Goon's Tree discovers his staff and his identity. Poppy says, "Don't be a stranger now," which is a way of saying goodbye, but also a meta line that now this character must cease to be known only as a stranger. And he's called Grandalf twice in rapid succession, and tripping on the Gand, the twisted fingery knob in which he will plug his pipe in one day, he returns to Tom Bombadil and declares himself as Gandalf. Tom says,
"Now let the song begin."
He's referring to the literal song they're about to sing together, but also song is in story, as this is the true beginning of the story of Gandalf the Grey. Their singing ends with this.
Oh, Tom Bombadil and the River Daughter.
The River Daughter is Tom's wife, and the one person in the room Tom was speaking to in the past episode. Narvi tells Durin the Younger that the 6 other Dwarven lords want to collect the rings that they paid his father for, and that his brother is gaining support to be the new king of the dwarves. Durin having a younger brother was mentioned back in season 1, but it has not been mentioned since, and he doesn't have a known brother in the lore. But we will see what happens with his other brother in season 3. Galadriel wakes up in a gorge in what will become Rivendell. This gorge, the ridge, the waterfall, even the trees all match the way Rivendell looks in the real-world part of Switzerland that Peter Jackson used for his films. The Sindarin name for Rivendell, Imladris, means deep dale of the cleft, and it references this gorge exactly. There's also a small stream running past Galadriel, which looks like it flows into what I assume is the Bruning River below, where the rest of the refugees are gathered. In the lore, Rivendell is established over the next 2 years and then quickly besieged by Sauron's forces, which could imply a more defensive route. There's a great subtle moment here as Elrond lingers with Nenya on his finger before handing it back over to Galadriel, and Galadriel visibly reacts when the ring is put on her finger. She's still in pain from her wounds, and the ring healed her. Galadriel remembers Celebrimbor's final words to her, and how it's not strength that drives out the darkness, but light. And for the first time, here in the land that will one day become Rivendell, we see the true light. Not a deceptive light from Sauron, but the true light of the Valar, blessing these souls for the dark days ahead. Huge thanks to Noah Chen for helping me write this breakdown. I would not have been able to do this without him. Comment down below with your thoughts. Follow me at EA Voss. Subscribe to all 3 channels in the New Rockstars network for breakdowns and news coverage of everything you love. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.